The Vietnam War, or Second Indochina War, is infamous. It was one of the most gruesome Cold War era conflicts, and it tarnished the USA's reputation forever. But America isn't the only large Western nation the Vietnamese have routed, and for there to be a second Indochina War, there had to be a first. Here, in the wake of World War II, Ho Chi Minh stood up to the French to expel them from what was then French Indochina. It was a brutal 7-year conflict that is so often swept under the rug. In this 3-part video, we mean to rectify that. This is the story of the First Indochina War, or as many in Vietnam remember it, the Anti-French Resistance War. As with many of the 20th century's wars, the First Indochina War was sparked by World War II. On the 25th of June 1940, France fell to the Germans, and the Vichy government, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, replaced the Third Republic. At this time, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were ruled by the French in what was called French Indochina, so these colonial territories fell under the Vichy administration. As the Vichy government collaborated with the Germans, with Vichy France ultimately coming under direct German control, it had to collaborate with Germany's soon-to-be Axis allies too, notably Imperial Japan, and the Japanese had had their eyes on Indochina for quite some time. Fighting the Chinese in the concurrent Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese naturally wanted to cut off China's supply lines. One major supply line was the Kunming-Haiphong Railway, which went from the Indo-Chinese port of Haiphong to Hanoi and then into the Chinese province of Yunnan. Staging their troops in Indochina, specifically in the region of Tonkin, would allow them to open up a new front against their enemies in China too. With the collaborationist Vichy government now in charge of French Indochina, Japan started laying on pressure in a political sense, and the Vichy government was given an ultimatum. On one hand, they could close all supply routes to China, let Japanese troops pass through Indochina, let Japanese air forces use their air bases, and give the Japanese Navy basing rights at Guangzhou. On the other hand, the Japanese could invade. While an agreement was ultimately reached, some Japanese units weren't interested in negotiating, so they attacked the French border post of Dongdang and the province of Lang Son. From the 22nd to the 26th of September 1940, Japanese forces marched into northern Indochina. Following that, Japan said sorry, released the French they had taken as POWs, and returned control of the towns they had seized to the French, at least on the surface. After all, why would they go to war with the French when they could just rule them from behind the scenes and use French Indochina as a base from which they could fight everyone else? Not to mention that puppeteering the French would get a whole lot easier after the Tripartite Pact had been signed on the 27th, and Japan officially had Germany on its side. In Vietnam, however, not everyone was happy living under the thumb of Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai, a puppet of a French government that was itself puppeteered by the Japanese. The people's lives were more uncertain than ever, and as World War II escalated, they whispered of revolution. Before we get to that though, the Vichy French were having serious problems in October 1940, just after the Japanese invasion. Emboldened by the fall of France, the Thai Major General, Plaek Pibulsonggram, decided to bomb French Indochina and then launch an offensive through Laos and Cambodia to regain territory previously lost to the French. The Thai army was better equipped, more experienced, and numerically superior to the French, boasting some 60,000 troops, as opposed to the 50,000 troops fielded by the French. They also had more aircraft and more experienced pilots. French naval forces reigned superior in the sea though. From early to mid-January 1941, Thailand appeared to have the upper hand, overrunning Laos and pushing into Cambodia. But on the 17th, French naval forces defeated the Royal Thai Navy in the Battle of Ko Chang, and it seemed the tide was turning. It was shortly after this that Japan stepped in as a mediator, arranging a ceasefire on the 28th. To satisfy Thailand, the Japanese made the French relinquish swaths of Laos and Cambodia to Pibul Songram. For the time being, this worked very much in Japan's favour, as the Japanese had improved their relationship with Thailand without absolutely destroying their relationship with the French. Now, back to Vietnam and those whispers of revolution. In February 1941, the leader of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, a man named Ho Chi Minh, returned home from France and established the Viet Minh in Pac Bo Cave in Vietnam's Cao Bang province. This was a coalition of communists and nationalists united in an anti-colonial independence movement against the Vichy French and the Japanese. Over the next 4 years, barring the 14 months he spent imprisoned in China, Ho Chi Minh consolidated his strength, receiving funding from the United States, the USSR, and China, and rallying as many as 1 million Vietnamese to his cause. On the 22nd of December 1944, he created the Vietnam Liberation Army and made General Vo Nguyen Giap, nicknamed Red Napoleon, its military commander. Just 3 days later, a contingent of the Liberation Army fought its first battle and won. This was the Battle of Kai Phat and Nha Gan, in which Red Napoleon personally led 33 revolutionaries in a raid against 2 French outposts, killing the outpost's armed French officers and forcing 37 colonial troops to surrender. As loot, Red Napoleon seized 40 rifles, which they would make good use of in the battles to come. By this point in the Greater War, following massive defeats in Burma and the Philippines, things weren't looking so hot for Japan. What pushed them over the edge in French Indochina, however, was the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Fearing an Allied invasion of Indochina, as well as a French uprising following the destruction of the Vichy government back in France, the Japanese stepped out from behind the curtain and seized Indochina from the French in a coup d'etat between March and May 1945. Here, some 55,000 Japanese overran some 65,000 French and French colonial soldiers throughout Indochina, capturing 15,000 and killing 4,000. Some 3,000 French fled into China, others joined the pro- or anti-Japanese guerrilla movements. At the same time, the Vietnamese were struggling with a different sort of enemy: famine. In the Vietnamese famine of 1945, between 400,000 and 2 million people starved to death as a direct result of the French and Japanese occupation, but also factors beyond their control. Natural disasters, including a series of droughts, floods, and typhoons, destroyed edible crops. The French and Japanese seized, hoarded, and exported food and burned it for fuel, forced the locals to grow industrial crops instead of edible crops, and generally did a terrible job of managing the distribution of food and alleviating starvation. Allied airstrikes against roads, warehouses, and transportation facilities did not make things any easier. All in all, Japan's coup d'etat cost Vietnam dearly. But the end times were near for the Japanese Empire. On the 6th of August, the US dropped the first bomb on the Japanese home islands, and on the 14th, Japan agreed to surrender. With his people starving and the Japanese laying down their guns, Ho Chi Minh's forces seized Hanoi and most of Indochina, persuading the puppet emperor Bao Dai to abdicate. This was known as the August Revolution, an event punctuated by Ho Chi Minh's famous independence speech, which borrowed language directly from the US Declaration of Independence. But Ho Chi Minh wasn't in the clear just yet. In fact, his first Great War was only just getting started, and by the time of his death, he would be neck deep in the dead. But we'll save that for part 2 of this video, now that we've set the stage for the First Indochina War. As we said in part 1 of this video, the First Indochina War is often overshadowed by the Second Indochina War, or Vietnam War, despite the fact that it was one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Where we left off, the Japanese had just lost the Second World War, and Ho Chi Minh had just taken Hanoi and much of Indochina, and persuaded the puppet emperor Bao Dai to abdicate in what was deemed the August Revolution. Now that World War II was over, the Japanese let the Viet Minh take control of Indochina, while the French and British were moved into Saigon to restore order, and the Chinese occupied Hanoi. The Japanese in South Vietnam surrendered to a Franco-British task force led by Generals Philippe Leclerc and Douglas Gracie, while those in the north surrendered to some 200,000 nationalist Chinese troops under General Liu Han. Of course, both of these actions compromised Ho Chi Minh's hold on Indochina. While the French government reinstated in France, the French wanted their colony back, and they were willing to fight for it. From September 1945 to March 1946, the Franco-British task force released Japanese and Vichy French POWs to help them assert control in Saigon. While they primarily fought the Viet Minh, several other Vietnamese organizations got involved, fighting on both sides of this 6-month war. Ultimately, the task force beat the Viet Minh back, driving them out of the city and into the countryside. Following the task force victory, General Gracie took his soldiers and left Indochina to General Leclerc and his men. On the other hand, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese Kuomintang or Nationalist Party, wanted to increase his influence in Vietnam, directly contesting the Viet Minh. To achieve this, he armed the Viet Quoc, a Vietnamese nationalist party modeled after the Kuomintang. According to the Red Napoleon, the Viet Quoc was a group of reactionaries plotting to rely on Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and their rifle barrels to snatch a few crumbs. Unfortunately for the Viet Quoc, the nationalist Chinese troops withdrew from North Vietnam in February 1946, agreeing to do so if the French let go of their holdings in China, including Shanghai. Without the Chinese there to protect the Viet Quoc, the Viet Minh ate them alive, massacring thousands in what was called the Great Purge. Without the Chinese nationalists there to bother them, the French moved on to the north, landing in the port of Haiphong. Throughout 1946, fearing things would return to how they were before World War II, the Viet Minh opened up peace talks with France. These were known as the Fontainebleau Agreements, but an actual agreement was never reached, as the French refused to give the Viet Minh the freedom they wanted. In November, armed clashes broke out in Haiphong, and the French answered by bombarding the Vietnamese sections of the city, killing 6,000 in what became known as the Haiphong Massacre. On the 19th of December 1946, the Viet Minh set off explosives in Hanoi's power plant, consigning the city to darkness, and then started attacking French soldiers and civilians alike. Red Napoleon's order to his 30,000 soldiers was to stand together, go into battle, destroy the invaders, and save the nation. By the 18th of February, the French had driven the Viet Minh out, and the First Indochina War had begun. As with every post-World War II conflict, both the Viet Minh and the French enjoyed support from various foreign nations and internal organizations at different stages of the First Indochina War. From the get-go, the Viet Minh were advised, trained, and armed by forces of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and even fought side by side with them at times. This relationship became even stronger after the CCP defeated the Kuomintang in the concurrent Chinese Civil War. To put the CCP's support into perspective, it shipped some 155,000 small arms, 58 million rounds of ammo, 4,600 artillery pieces, over 1 million artillery shells, and much war material and supplies to Vietnam between 1950 and 1956. The Viet Minh also had a second Red ally in the USSR, which provided weapons, ammunition, artillery pieces such as the Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, trucks such as the Gaz-51s, fuel, military advisors, and more. A remnant from World War II, thousands of Japanese soldiers avoided repatriation and shame at the end of the global conflict to stay in Indochina and fight for the Viet Minh. As many as 5,000 helped to train the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War, working out of military installations such as the Quang Ngai Army Academy. As for the French, they enjoyed support from the French Union, which has succeeded the French Empire, at least in name, in 1946. The French Far East Expeditionary Corps was composed of soldiers from French territories, including but not limited to Morocco, Senegal, and Tunisia, while some 325,000 Indo-Chinese troops fought for them too, some under the former Emperor Bao Dai's Vietnamese National Army, some with the kingdoms of Cambodia and Laos, and some with other anti-Viet Minh organizations in Vietnam. Hoping to prevent the spread of communism following the CCP's victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the United States quickly became one of France's biggest supporters. It provided supplies, soldiers, and naval and air assistance, and even toyed with the idea of dropping a nuke somewhere. Perhaps the US's greatest contribution was Operation Passage to Freedom, however, where they transported some 310,000 civilians and soldiers out of North Vietnam and into South Vietnam between 1954 and 1955. Returning to the early days of the war, Red Napoleon avoided a head-on confrontation with the French, resorting to guerrilla tactics instead. In October 1947, however, the French almost delivered a knockout blow. This was Operation Lay, in which the French dropped 1,100 paratroopers on the city of Bac Can, hoping to catch Ho Chi Minh with his pants down. While unsuccessful in capturing Ho Chi Minh, some 15,000 French troops entered the city as some 40,000 Viet Minh troops closed the noose on the paratroopers, and the French were able to wound or kill between 9,000 and 10,000 of them. Offensives like Operation Lay were expensive though, so France tried to achieve victory through politics instead. In March 1949, the French entered an agreement with the former Emperor Bao Dai, granting him control of Vietnam as an autonomous government within the French Union. This was called the State of Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh saw right through it. He wanted, quote, real independence, not Bao Dai independence. That same year, the aforementioned Vietnamese National Army was created, fighting in league with the Expeditionary Corps. As we mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and this changed the whole dynamic of the First Indochina War. Now, the Viet Minh could retreat to the Chinese border to pick up vast quantities of weapons and supplies. Armed by the CCP, Red Napoleon claimed victory after victory in attacks on French garrisons in North Vietnam. One of his larger victories, he claimed, was in the Autumn-Winter Border Campaign. Between the 30th of September and the 18th of October 1950, the Viet Minh wiped out some 8,000 troops of the Expeditionary Force and Vietnamese National Army, making extensive use of ambush tactics along Route Coloniale 4 from Cao Bang to Lang Son. Some of the heaviest fighting took place in the first half of 1951. Unwilling to lose any more ground to the Viet Minh, the famous French general Jean-Marie de Latte de Tassigny arrived in Indochina and established a defensive line around Hanoi, effectively closing it off against the Gulf of Tonkin. This was the aptly named De Latte Line, composed of a network of 1,200 concrete blockhouses connected by roads capable of bearing 30-ton tanks. In January, Red Napoleon tried to breach the line at Vinh Yên, but got completely smashed upon launching a head-on assault with his 308th Division. De Latte answered this reckless charge with airstrikes and napalm, killing as many as 1,600 enemy troops and wounding a further 6,000, according to French estimates. This battle marked the end of the 1951 good times for Red Napoleon, who suffered defeat after defeat, testing the De Latte defenses. The war was not over though. Far from it. In January 1952, General De Latte left Indochina with cancer, to which he succumbed soon after, and Red Napoleon became emboldened, spreading through most of the Tonkin region. The French, now commanded by General Raoul Salan, had to make a big play, or Red Napoleon would become too powerful to stop. But we'll save that chapter of the story for part 3 of this video, in which we'll reach the bloody conclusion of the First Indochina War. In part 1 of this video, we laid the foundation of the First Indochina War, while in part 2, we discussed the surrender of the Japanese army in Vietnam and the return of the French before we delved into the conflict proper. By now, it should be clear that the First Indochina War was indeed a politically complicated, blood-stained affair, made even more complicated by the concurrent Chinese Civil War and the rising backdrop of the Cold War. In this third and final part of our mini-series on the First Indochina War, we arrive at its devastating conclusion. Where we left off, the French general Raoul Salan had just taken over from General Dalat, who established the Dalat Line and killed the momentum of Viet Minh General Vo Nguyen Giap, or Red Napoleon's 1951 offensives. With Dalat gone, the Viet Minh continued its attack on French forces withdrawing from Hoa Binh, where they had dealt the French a defeat, albeit at a heavy cost, back in November 1951 after General Salan took over the defense. By the 22nd of February 1952, the French had finished their withdrawal to the Dalat Line, where they regrouped and staved off guerrilla attacks for much of the year. In October, Red Napoleon tested the French defense once again, this time at Nha San. But French hedgehog tactics proved too much for the attackers, who withdrew after taking some 6,000 casualties. Afterwards, the French strategically bailed from Nha San to prepare for a larger Viet Minh assault on French outposts along the Black River. With Red Napoleon applying heavy pressure to the vulnerable outposts, General Salan was looking to make a big play. On the 29th of October, he launched Operation Lorraine. In response to his 30,000-man offensive into Viet Minh territory, which was aimed at the district of Phu Yen, Red Napoleon simply withdrew his forces, sabotaging the French as they advanced. Salan had no choice but to can Operation Lorraine and begin a withdrawal. At Chan Muong on the 17th of November, the Viet Minh ambushed the French column, inflicting heavy casualties until French air support and an Indo-Chinese bayonet charge cleared the way for the column's retreat. Some 1,200 French troops perished in the failed operation. The following year, Red Napoleon switched up his tactics, planning to invade neighbouring Laos instead of smashing headfirst into the Dalat Line in the hopes of taking Hanoi. In May, General Salan was removed in favour of General Gonri Navarre, who studied the successes of French hedgehog tactics at Nha San and opted to put a stop to the Viet Minh's invasion of Laos at a small town named Dien Bien Phu on the border. The French launched Operation Castor on the 20th of November 1953, dropping paratroopers over Dien Bien Phu so they could secure its airstrip. The paratroopers clashed with the Viet Minh, but by the 22nd, the town was in French hands. Under Colonel Christian de Castries, the French bolstered their defences, deploying over 9,000 troops plus 1,800 support personnel and setting up a hedgehog defence to once again defeat the aggressive Red Napoleon. But the Viet Minh general had learnt from his experience at Nha San. He wouldn't charge recklessly into the spikes of the French defence. Instead, he would lock down their airstrip with anti-aircraft guns, bombard the crap out of them with artillery, and place some 50,000 troops in the wooded hills surrounding the valley and the French position, which he likened to a rice bowl. On the 13th of March 1954, it began. Viet Minh artillery, mortars, and recoilless rifles opened up on the French position designated Beatrice. The French battalion commander was blown apart and communications crumbled. After the French were nice and soft, the Viet Minh advanced, breaking through the French defense with sappers and gunning their way to victory at this position. After this crushing blow, the French artillery commander in charge of the defense committed suicide with a hand grenade. He could do nothing to stop the Viet Minh artillery dug into the surrounding hills, and he couldn't live with the shame of it. On the 14th and 15th of March, the Viet Minh laid waste to the French position, Gabrielle, with artillery, and then assaulted the stunned defenders, just as they had done at Beatrice. Here, as it was at Beatrice, the Viet Minh infantry assault cost the attackers more lives than they took, but the position fell nonetheless. At the nearby position of Anne Marie, many of the defending troops abandoned their posts or defected on the 17th. So low was their morale at this point. For the rest of the month, Red Napoleon mostly left the French to stew in their own misery, while he prepared for a massive assault on the heart of Dien Bien Phu. At night, on the 30th of March, the Viet Minh 312th Division attacked the French position Dominique, seizing 2 of the position's outposts, but then biting off more than they could chew. As they advanced on the next outpost, French artillerymen leveled their 105mm howitzers and fired them into the division's ranks, 18th century cannon style. The French also fired on the enemy troops with anti-aircraft guns, ultimately forcing a retreat. The Viet Minh had better luck at the French position Elian, taking Elian 1 and most of Elian 2 on the 31st. French counterattacks at Elian 1 and Dominique were ultimately unsuccessful, but French Major Marcel Bigard managed to drive the Viet Minh out of Elian 2 with the aid of French tanks. The French also clung tooth and nail to the position Huguette, which contained the airfield and was located on the west side of the Nam Yam River, and French planes continued to do their best to resupply the men via parachute troops despite heavy Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire. By the 5th of April, Red Napoleon had switched up his tactics again. French artillery and air support were delivering some serious hurt to his ground forces, so he ordered his men to dig trenches. It was in these muddy hellholes that the morale took a turn for the worse, with soldiers being threatened with death if they didn't continue the attack, and the wounded often going unattended. Things didn't improve for the Viet Minh when Major Bigard bombarded Elian 1 to the moon on the 10th of April, and then followed said bombardment with small unit infiltrations, ultimately retaking the position. Over the Nam Yam River, however, things were looking better for the attackers. By the 22nd of April, the Viet Minh had taken the vast majority of the airfield, preventing French reinforcements from landing there. Without fresh supplies and troops, it was now only a matter of time for the French. In early May, Red Napoleon wrested control of Elian 1 and the remainder of Dominique and Huguette. The French at Elian 2 held on for a while longer, even against the Soviet Katyusha multiple rocket launchers the Viet Minh brought to the party. They could not withstand the detonation of a mine beneath the outpost, however, and with Elian 2 devastated, Red Napoleon sent in some 25,000 troops to mop up the remaining 3,000 French. The last words to come out of the French headquarters were as follows: "The enemy has overrun us. We are blowing up everything. Vive la France." By the end of it, the Viet Minh had captured some 11,700 French, of which over 4,400 were wounded. As many as 2,300 died in the battle, while more than 1,700 were branded MIA. On the Viet Minh side, the French estimated that they slew 8,000 and wounded a further 15,000 men. Either way, the French defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a game-ending blow to the French in Indochina. While they were fighting at Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 Geneva Conference was in progress, and the French defeat influenced the conference's outcome. In light of France's ever-weakening position, there would be a general ceasefire. Vietnam would be temporarily partitioned into what was, in essence, the Communist North Vietnam, or the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and South Vietnam, officially the Republic of Vietnam. France would withdraw to the south and then get the hell out of Indochina, and there would be an election in July 1956 to unify Vietnam. Additionally, people could move between the north and south without hassle for 300 days, facilitated by the US Operation Passage to Freedom, which we mentioned in part 1. Not everything went according to plan, however. The new Prime Minister of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, wasn't interested in following through with the July 1956 election, and many of Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh soldiers stayed behind in the south. When the Viet Minh realized that a fair election was not on the table, they took up their guns, and this eventually escalated into the Second Indochina War, or as some know it, the American War in Vietnam.
History is funny in that entire wars can sometimes get lost to it. Often, the bloodier, more atrocious conflicts take the spotlight, notably the two world wars and Vietnam. That doesn't mean some of the lesser-known wars weren't horrible though, nor that they were insignificant. Far from it. One conflict which tends to get swept under the rug is the Malayan Emergency. While you've probably heard of the emergency before, you may not know what actually happened on the Malay Peninsula between 1948 and 1960 in the wake of the Japanese occupation. In this video, we hope to rectify that, telling the story of an oft-forgotten war fought between the British Commonwealth and an army of communist guerrillas. The British Empire remains the largest the world has ever seen, and from the early 1800s to 1957, many of the states of the Malayan Peninsula were part of it. From the 1800s to 1942, 4 of these states, including Selangor, Perak, Negri, Sembilan, and Pahang, formed the Federated Malay States and were under the control and protection of Britain. A further 5 made up the Unfederated Malay States. These were Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Perlis, and Terengganu. Lastly, 4 physically smaller states located on the peninsula made up the British Strait settlements, including Penang, Malacca, Dinding, and Singapore. Collectively, these federated states, unfederated states, and colonies were loosely defined as British Malaya. While British rule of Malaya came with its own slew of problems, nothing could have prepared the Malayans for the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. Just an hour before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Army made an amphibious landing on a beach in the unfederated state of Kelantan. This was at one of the most northern points of British Malaya on the eastern coast. After defeating the British Indian Army on the beach, the Japanese stormed south along the peninsula, smashing through the Allied defensive lines. Fast losing their foothold, the British made a deal with the Malayan Communist Party, or MCP. In short, they released ethnic Chinese communists from prison, armed them, and trained them to fight a guerrilla war against the Japanese. These guerrillas were later deemed the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, or MPA-JA. While eager, they weren't deployed in time to have a significant impact upon the advancing Japanese. They were also too few in number. By the 31st of January 1942, British Malaya was in Japanese hands. Singapore, however, did not fall until mid-February, following the largest British surrender in history. The Japanese invasion of the peninsula was a massive blow to British morale. It had also broken the illusion that the British had things under control in Malaya and demonstrated to the peninsula that the British could bleed. As for the MPA-JA, they had less than 200 members at this time, and many of their attempts to harass the invaders were met with reprisals against Chinese civilians. As a result, many Chinese fled into the forests where they worked with the MPJA or joined their ranks. Throughout the brutal Japanese occupation and following some major setbacks such as the Batu Caves massacre, the MPA-JA's numbers swelled, reaching 4,500 guerrillas by 1943. By the end of 1944, that number was greater than 7,000. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, however, the British stepped back in before the MPJA could seize control, outright banning the communist organization and recalling their guns. Almost 5,500 weapons were returned to the British in demobilization parades, but not all of them were returned. After World War II, the British merged the various states of what was formerly British Malaya into the Malayan Union, a British colony, to consolidate their hold on the peninsula. Singapore was the only state that remained separate. The Malayan Union was short-lived, however, established in April 1946 and succeeded by the Federation of Malaya in 1948. This new federation was a British protectorate, and the situation there was far from ideal. Many Malayans were sick of the British and now knew that they could be defeated. World War I had damaged the economy and unemployment was high. This prompted people to push for trade unions, which inclined them toward the MCP. The communists organised hundreds of strikes between 1946 and 1948, and the British colonial police responded with arrests, deportations, and the banning of trade unions. On the 16th of June 1948, Malayan communists gunned down 3 British plantation managers in the town of Sungai Seput in the state of Perak. Following these murders, the British declared the situation an emergency and things went south from there. Ready to wrest control of Malaya from the British, many ex-MPA-JA members banded together to form the Malayan National Liberation Army, or MNLA. Now they would fight another guerrilla war, this time against the people who had previously trained and armed them. The Malayan Emergency, or as some know it, the Anti-British National Liberation War, had begun. Now, many historians make comparisons between the emergency and the Vietnam War due to the time in which the emergency occurred and some of the strategies employed and atrocities committed. There were more differences between these conflicts, however, differences that had a drastic effect on the overall result of the war. Notably, the scale of the two conflicts can't really be compared. When the PVAN and Viet Cong boasted forces whose numbers were in the hundreds of thousands, the MNLA reached a peak of some 8,000 troops, and unlike in Vietnam, the MNLA didn't enjoy military support from any powerful external nation. Much of the MNLA was ethnically Chinese as well, representing just one of the peninsula's ethnic groups, a group for which many Malayans had no love. Still, there were over 3 million ethnic Chinese living in Malaya at the time, of which as many as 1 million may have been MNLA sympathizers. Unlike America in the Vietnam War, the British sought to avoid branding the Malayan Emergency as a war. Rather than fielding massive armies and marching headfirst into the fray, they answered unconventional tactics in kind. And they also contested the MNLA with some 250,000 members of the Malayan Home Guard and 65,000 police, many of whom were Malayan. British and British Commonwealth forces amounted to around 40,000 troops. Despite their numbers and despite how they wanted the war to appear to the Malayans and the rest of the world, the British did not simply roll over the MNLA and were not opposed to playing dirty. With the MNLA woven through the jungle and receiving support from the rural Chinese population, the British, a term we're using as a bit of a catch-all for the British Commonwealth, and the pro-British Malayan forces, weren't initially sure how to handle the guerrillas who targeted Britain's rubber plantations and tin mines in the hopes that it would bankrupt them. Things changed in 1950, however, when Lieutenant General Sir Harold Rawdon Briggs came to town. As the British Director of Operations, Briggs implemented the appropriately named Briggs Plan, which was basically to starve the MNLA out. The British constructed 450 fortified settlements to detain ethnic Chinese after they forcefully relocated as many as 400,000 from their homes. Doing so, they prevented these people from producing food that could potentially end up in the mouths of the MNLA. This strategy had the added effect of nipping civilian intelligence networks in the bud. As many as 100,000 non-Chinese Malayans were also placed in these so-called new villages, however, leaving a sour taste in the Malayans' mouths. The British weren't above burning farmland and houses to smoke out the pro-MNLA civilians, nor spraying crops and trees with Agent Orange to further starve the MNLA. They often laid waste to jungles and swamps with aerial and artillery bombardments to blast the guerrillas out of hiding and into ambushes. They also flew in specialized units adept at jungle warfare, such as the Royal Marines and the SAS, to give the guerrillas a taste of their own medicine. Sweeping the countryside with entire armies simply wouldn't have worked. If burning civilian homes and Agent Orange weren't grim enough for you, the British committed at least one massacre against the civilian population. We're talking, of course, about the Batang Kali massacre of December 1948, later described as Britain's My Lai and swept under the rug by the British government for over 60 years. Here, a British unit known as the Scots Guard rounded up 25 civilians at a rubber plantation, interrogated them, and then shot 25 of them dead in front of their wives and children. After bringing in some Iban headhunters from the Borneo to fight the MNLA, some British soldiers assumed the practice of headhunting, taking the heads of slain guerrillas as trophies. torture was used as an interrogation method and to incite fear as well. Atrocities aside, the Briggs Plan largely worked. Throughout the 1950s, the MNLA's strength waned. To put it in perspective, by the end of the conflict, some 6,700 guerrillas had been killed. In September 1955, the government offered the remaining communists amnesty if they put down their guns and turned themselves in. Few took this offer, and the government retracted it in February 1956. Concurrently, the Federation of Malaya, sick of all the drama, was striving for independence, which it gained on the 31st of August 1957. Over the next 3 years, the emergency petered out, with the MNLA's demands for peace getting knocked back again and again. The surviving guerrillas fled to the Thai border in 1960, where they regrouped in preparation for the second Malayan Emergency, which would begin in 8 years' time. In a recent video, we discussed the Malayan Emergency, an oft-forgotten conflict fought in British Malaya between 1948 and 1960. While the British, largely by means of the infamous Briggs Plan, may have come out on top in that war, the Malayan Communist Party wasn't yet ready to give up its gloves. In 1968, after an 8-year lull, they took up arms once again, sparking what was known as the Communist Insurgency in Malaysia, or the Second Malayan Emergency. Without repeating everything we covered in our video on the First Malayan Emergency, this is roughly what happened. During the Second World War, the Japanese invaded Malaya via a beach in the state of Kelantan and smashed through the British defensive lines. Losing ground fast, the British struck a deal with the Malayan Communist Party, or MCP, freeing ethnic Chinese communists from prison so they could help staunch the Japanese advance by means of guerrilla operations. These guerrillas were together the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, or MPA-JA, and by the time they were ready to rumble, it was too late. The Japanese had already taken Malaya. Throughout the war, the MPA-JA grew to include some 7,000 guerrillas. After America nuked Japan and Japan surrendered, the British returned to Malaya, but now the Malayans knew the British could bleed. In 1948, the remnants of the demobilized MPA-JA reunited under the Malayan National Liberation Front, or MNLA, and fought a second guerrilla war, this time against the British, the pro-British Malayans, and the Commonwealth. Under the Briggs Plan, the British forcefully relocated or detained much of Malaya's ethnic Chinese population, denying the MNLA its support system. They also burned their crops. In the end, coupled with the 6,700 casualties inflicted upon the guerrillas, the Briggs Plan wore the MNLA down and its remnants fled across the Thai border to regroup. In 1963, Malaya federated with Singapore, Sarawak and North Borneo, and Malaysia was born. While Peninsular Malaysia was no longer under the yoke of the British, things were far from chill. Racial tensions between Malays and Chinese soared. Communist insurgents were causing a ruckus in Sarawak, Malaysia and Indonesia were fighting an undeclared war in Borneo, Singapore was soon to be expelled from the Federation, and Moro pirates from the Philippines were sacking the Malayan state of Sabah. To top it off, the MCP was totally not in power, and that simply wouldn't do. Along the Malaysian southern Thailand border, the MNLA guerrillas stirred. After its defeat in the First Malayan Emergency, the MCP, headed by Secretary General Chin Peng, retrained its guerrillas and shoved its ideology even further down their throats. By 1968, there were just 600 9-to-5 guerrillas and 1,000 reservists in bases along the Thai border. But these men were willing to fight and die for what they believed in, and many were experienced veterans. Most were ethnic Chinese, though the MNLA recruited non-Chinese Malays and Thais as well. They even established what they called the Islamic Brotherhood Party to coax Muslims into their ranks. Back in 1961, Chin had met with Deng Xiaoping of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, in secret, and Deng had convinced Chin that Peninsular Malaysia was screaming for revolt. He had even promised Chin a cheeky $100,000 if he launched a second insurgency. By June 1968, Chin's guerrillas were ready to roll. On the 17th, they ambushed the security forces of the Malaysian government in Croh in the peninsula's north, killing 17 men. In May the following year, there was a general election. In the lead up to the event, the MNLA spread throughout the peninsula, encouraging Chinese youths to boycott the ruling multi-ethnic coalition known as the Alliance Party. The alliance lost seats to the Chinese-dominated parties, the Democratic Action Party and Parti Gerakan, and a few days later, race riots broke out in Kuala Lumpur, with Malays, Chinese and Indians murdering each other in the streets. Security forces were deployed and the government suspended the parliament, declaring a state of emergency. All in all, more conservative estimates claim that 196 people were killed in the riots. Most of the dead were Chinese, and some 6,000 Chinese homes and businesses went up in flames. It's unclear how much the MNLA contributed to the election result and the subsequent riots, though its numbers had swelled in the process. To facilitate further growth, they set up a secret radio station known as the Voice of the People's Revolution to spread Maoist propaganda throughout peninsular Malaysia. The Malaysian government responded as the British had in the First Malayan Emergency, with special forces. In October 1969, the Spec Ops Unit Very Able Troopers 69, or VAT 69, was created. Some 1,600 officers from the Royal Malaysia Police applied for the unit, but only 60 passed the basic commando training tests and went on to be trained by the British SAS. By 1972, the SAS had trained 104 men, making a full squadron. After the SAS left, the New Zealand Special Air Service flew in and trained a further 208. A fourth squadron was later readied by VAT officers themselves. The special branch of the Royal Malaysia Police also set out to wage a war of counterintelligence against the guerrillas. With VAT 69 and the special branch conducting counterinsurgency operations against the MNLA, the communist organization started to crumble from the inside out. Rumors spread that the MCP and MNLA had been compromised. The dude to your left could easily be a government spy. The MCP Central Committee investigated these rumors, deeming that as many as 90% of the ethnic Chinese Thai MNLA recruits were, in fact, spies. Some believed, however, that the Central Committee itself had been infiltrated. The VAT and Special Branch had made an absolute mess of things, which was exactly what they wanted, and in 1970, the MCP split into two breakaway factions: the Communist Party of Malaya Marxist-Leninist, or CPM-ML, and the Communist Party of Malaya Revolutionary Faction, or CPM-RF, if you weren't sick of all the acronyms yet. The MNLA guerrillas split up as well, creating three distinct groups, one based in Thailand's East Betong, which remained with Chin and the MCP Central Committee, one in West Betong, and one in Sadao. These organizations continued to fight for their shared goals throughout the early 1970s, and the Malaysian government continued to wear them down. One of the ways the government did this was through the Security and Development Program, or KESPAN. Essentially, the KESPAN program introduced to the peninsula improved security and development. We're talking about better policing, including the creation of the Volunteer Corps and Neighbourhood Watches, the censorship of insurgent propaganda, improved governmental coordination, rural development, including the construction of public utilities, roads, schools and hospitals, and the relocation of villages from areas prone to communist indoctrination. Throughout this time, the West Betong and Sadao groups disintegrated, ultimately surrendering to the Thai government in 1987. Those still fighting for the splintered MCP now understood that they were fighting a losing battle. In fact, the aforementioned Deng Xiaoping had been encouraging his old friend Chin to throw in the towel since 1981. He also pulled support of the MNLA's secret radio station. In 1988, the Malaysian government delivered a relatively cordial knockout blow, inviting the MCP leadership to attend a negotiation for peace. At this point, Malaysia's economy was going strong, and with reference to the overarching climate of the Cold War, the Eastern Bloc was falling apart. There was less poverty and racism, and no one was screaming for a communist revolt anymore. The times had changed. The MCP signed the so-named Peace Agreement of Hat Yai in Thailand on the 2nd of December 1989. Some former guerrillas, inspired by government financial incentives, returned to Malaysia, while others chose to stay behind and live in the villages on the Thai border. As for Chin, he wanted to go home, but the Malaysian government kept denying the poor bloke. He died in Bangkok in 2013. As for the second Malayan Emergency, that ended with the peace agreement. The MNLA was no more. Relations between China and Taiwan are hairy to say the least, but the friction between these two places is by no means a novel thing. That part of the world has seen more than its fair share of bloodshed, and for worse or for better, China and Taiwan's pasts are inextricably intertwined. In this video, we explore their shared past, focusing on the conflicts fought between China and Taiwan throughout the latter half of the 20th century. In 1911, Sun Yat-sen's victory in the Xinhai Revolution saw the end of the Qing dynasty and imperial dynasties in China in general. When the dust settled, the Republic of China, or ROC, had been established. But Sun Yat-sen wasn't powerful enough to take control of the country. He was forced to negotiate with Yuan Shikai, commander of the Qing dynasty's Baiyang army. As a result, Yuan became the first president of the ROC. Once in power, Yuan deemed himself the Emperor of China and tried to reinstate a monarchy. This drew the ire of Sun Yat-sen and everyone who had fought for a republic. In 1916, Yuan died of uremia, and the Baiyang army split into warlord factions, further fragmenting the nation. In 1919, Sun Yat-sen re-established the Kuomintang, or KMT, also known as the Chinese Nationalist Party, and strived to reunify China. About 6 years later, Sun Yat-sen succumbed to cancer and the KMT's reins passed to Chiang Kai-shek. Working in league with the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, in what was called the First United Front, or KMT-CCP alliance, Chiang Kai-shek hoped to crush the warlords in a vast military campaign known as the Northern Expedition. The United Front enjoyed support from the USSR, while Imperial Japan supported the Baiyang warlords. In April 1927, less than a year into the Northern Expedition, underground elements from the KMT slaughtered some 5,000 to 10,000 CCP-aligned communists in Shanghai to weaken the CCP so that Chiang Kai-shek could consolidate his rule. The CCP was largely undone and the United Front ceased to be. Still, the KMT continued the Northern Expedition and had secured control of the ROC by December 1928. Their rule, however, was shaky at best, as the KMT had been at war with CCP-aligned communists since the massacre in Shanghai, and the remnants of the CCP were regathering and gaining momentum. Until 1936, the KMT and CCP went at each other's throats in one of the bloodiest wars in human history, the Chinese Civil War. Meanwhile, throughout all of this, Taiwan was occupied by Imperial Japan, with the Japanese having taken hold of the island during the First Sino-Japanese War back in the late 19th century. As if China wasn't suffering enough already, Japan launched a full-scale attack on the mainland in 1937, operating out of the puppet state of Manchukuo, which it established in its 1931 to 1932 invasion of Manchuria. The ensuing conflict was known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, in which the Japanese bolstered production in Taiwan to feed their war machine. With the Japanese at their doors, the KMT and CCP put their civil war on hold to band together against a common enemy. About 2 years into the Second Sino-Japanese War, something equally as terrible was unfolding in Europe. Without delving too deeply into China and Japanese-occupied Taiwan's involvement in the Second World War, as we've covered those topics in previous videos, the Japanese Navy made extensive use of Taiwan, operating out of the ports of Keelung and Tagao. Additionally, over 200,000 Taiwanese served in the Japanese military from 1937 to 1945, with more than 30,000 losing their lives. In the end, with the defeat of Imperial Japan, Taiwan was placed under the governance of the KMT, which was, as of then, still the ruling faction, and the Chinese Civil War resumed. After the end of the Sino-Japanese War and World War II, the CCP's forces grew to include over 3 million troops. From 1946 to 1949, the communists absolutely belted the KMT, forcing the nationalist government to flee again and again until the KMT ultimately crossed the Taiwan Strait and set up Taipei, bringing some 1.3 million anti-communist Chinese with them. In October 1949, CCP chairman Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, governing the mainland out of Beijing. At this point, the KMT still held some other islands too, including but not limited to Hainan and Pescadores Islands. No peace agreements were ever signed between the government in Taiwan and the CCP on the mainland, and Taiwan's status remains ambiguous. The CCP believes the island is merely a self-governing province of the People's Republic of China. On the other hand, the government in Taiwan believes Taiwan is an independent country, though they have yet to make an official declaration of independence, as doing so would likely lead to war. From 1949 to the present, tensions between China and Taiwan have erupted into a number of conflicts, some more violent than others. For now, we're going to delve into the first, second, and third Taiwan Strait crises. From 1949 to 1978, the KMT ruled Taiwan under martial law. Concurrently, in the early 50s, the Korean War had begun, with the US and UN supporting the South and the PRC supporting the North. In March 1950, the PRC landed some 115,000 troops on the island of Hainan on the South China Sea and wrested it from the ROC. Fearing what would happen if the PRC took Taiwan before they achieved victory in Korea, the US placed its 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Straits later that year, offering its support to Taiwan. In February 1953, about 6 months before the Korean Armistice Agreement, the 7th Fleet pulled out, and in August the following year, things escalated. With the American fleet gone, the ROC wanted to strengthen its position in the Taiwan Strait. It placed 58,000 troops on the island of Kinmen and 15,000 on the Matsu Islands. These islands are far closer to the mainland than Taiwan, and the PRC was understandably upset about it. On the 11th, PRC forces started shelling Kinmen and Matsu, and then the Dachen Islands. Among the dead were 2 American military advisors. This was a stark reminder for the Americans that a communist invasion of Taiwan was a very real possibility. On the 12th of September, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended dropping nuclear bombs on China, but President Eisenhower thankfully stood against such a drastic solution and didn't come to pass. Though, with Japan freshly irradiated, the threat wasn't taken lightly, and while island-to-island fighting continued through to May 1955, catastrophe was ultimately avoided and relatively few people died. In 1958, however, after both sides had had some time to lick their wounds, the PRC and ROC went at each other's throats again. Because the islands of Kinmen and the Matsu Islands hadn't had enough, the PRC started shelling them again on the 23rd of August. Over the following 2 days, PRC force attempted an amphibious landing on Dongding Island, southwest of Kinmen, but the ROC staved them off. As with the first Taiwan Strait crisis, the US was heavily involved. Once again, there was talk of nuclear weapons, but this time the USSR chimed in. Nuking China would force the Soviet Union to step in and honor its commitments to the PRC. This would be World War III. To support the ROC without inciting nuclear holocaust, the US Air Force deployed a range of aircraft, including F-100D Super Sabres, F-101C Voodoos, F-104A Starfighters, and B-57B Canberras. The Navy also outfitted ROC F-86 Sabres with new AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles so they could wreck the PRC's Soviet-made MiG fighters. The 7th Fleet stepped in too, and American artillery bolstered the defenses on Kinmen. In a dogfight on the 24th of October, ROC pilots used the aforementioned Sidewinder missiles to destroy 25 PRC MiGs. They destroyed 6 more throughout the rest of the conflict for just 2 F-86s shot down. The so-called crisis tapered due to US PRC diplomacy late in 1958. As strange as it sounds, the two sides agreed to shell each other on alternating days of the week. They also agreed to inform each other of exactly what they were going to shell. As the conflict went on, the live shells were replaced with propaganda leaflets. All in all, the casualty figures weren't too different from the first Taiwan Strait crisis, though around 80 civilians were killed. In May of Forces, or RSF, a paramilitary group born from the ashes of Janjaweed militias and led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, the deputy head of Sudan's Sovereign Council. On the other, the Sudanese armed forces and their leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, serves as the country's transitional ruler. The topic for discussion? A ceasefire that would allow much needed aid to reach the country's civilian population. After nearly a month of fighting, at least 750 people lie dead, including civilians. Those fleeing the conflict zone, ripped from their homes and livelihoods by the fighting, number in the thousands. In Jeddah, an agreement of sorts was reached, with both sides nominally agreeing to protect civilians, but the limits of this agreement were very clear. This is not a ceasefire, said a US official who witnessed the negotiations. Back in Sudan, the situation remains dire. The domestic healthcare system is on its knees, with volunteers staffing social media helplines in a desperate effort to help those who cannot reach the treatment centers. Aid workers, doctors, and volunteers are being targeted, threatened, and held by warring factions. Some have even been killed. And as foreign countries scrambled to get their citizens out of Sudan, it was the Sudanese population who were left with nowhere to go, wondering if they would live to see the end of their torment. What has brought us to this point? Why is the nation of Sudan, the third largest on the African continent, being plunged into conflict yet again after generation upon generation of warfare and bloodshed? In this episode of Untangling Africa, we're going to be charting the tragic story of Sudan and her people and questioning what the future holds. More than 5 millennia ago, before the rise of the first Egyptian dynasties, one of the earliest states on the planet was forming. This was Lower Nubia, in what is now Sudan, and it was here that archaeologists found burial sites of ancient rulers and evidence of a functioning government and society. For more than 1,000 years, Lower Nubia and Kush in the northern region went through cycle after cycle of golden age and disaster, existing sometimes in fractious peace, other times in all-out war with their powerful neighbor Egypt to the north. It is Egypt that has been written into the history books in the first place, becoming by far the most famous of the early North African civilizations. But the emergence of Nubia remains a key milestone in the history of human development, identity, and society. Like Egypt, Nubia and Kush benefited from their geographical location along the banks of the Nile. The Great River provided transport, supported agriculture, and even formed the basis for cultural and spiritual belief and early scientific understanding. And, like Egypt, Nubia and Kush would become victims of this prominent position too. As centuries stretched into millennia, the region found itself embattled and conquered time and time again by the Egyptians themselves, by Arabic armies, by the Ottomans, and by the British. The word Sudan emerges first in the medieval period and is itself an example of how colonial and invading forces have influenced the landscape and its people. Derived from Bilad al-Sudan, an Arabic term meaning land of the blacks, the name, which has become synonymous with this part of the world, is not an indigenous word at all. Influenced both by the Islamic world and the Christian world, and assailed from the north, east, and south, the Sudanese endured centuries of strife and tumult before Islam became the dominant cultural force. In 1820, the next major political force to control Sudan rose to prominence. The Ottoman Empire captured Khartoum and would rule for the next 60 years. The Viceroy of Egypt would appoint General Charles Gordon in 1874 to pacify the region of South Sudan and seek to extend the power of the Khedive, bringing Sudan and her people under the imperial yoke. After Ismail Pasha was sent to exile, Gordon left, but he wouldn't stay gone for long. In 1882, the British invaded Egypt to prevent failure of the nation and to ostensibly protect British influence in the region. However, this meant that the Nile needed to be protected at all costs. Sudan was again in the crosshairs, but the Sudanese proved capable of fierce resistance, refusing to be subjugated by the brash and arrogant Gordon. The general would pay for his attitude with his life, and with the lives of his men when they were massacred at Khartoum in 1885. Gordon's errors in judgment did not spell the end of colonial influence in the region. Less than 6 months after the victory in Khartoum, the leader of Sudan, the Mahdi Mohammed Ahmad, was dead. His successor, the Khalifa Abd Allah, presided over several years of famine at home and disaster on the battlefield before his autocratic government began to turn things around in the early 1890s. By this point, however, Sudan was very much in the sights of European colonists. The British negotiated terms with the Italians and the Germans, but could not achieve the same diplomatic success with the French. With a new sense of urgency, the British made fresh incursions into Sudan, and the region began almost 6 decades as imperial subjects. On January 1st, 1956, Sudan declared independence from the joint Anglo-Egyptian government that had ruled over the country since the end of the previous century. But what should have been a new dawn for Sudan turned sour before it had even got off the ground. The first movements toward independence had begun decades earlier after growing nationalist sentiment threatened to set Sudan aflame. In 1921, Ali Abd al-Latif founded the United Tribes Society, followed 3 years later by the White Flag League, an organization with the aim of expelling British colonial forces. After the assassination of the Governor-General in Egypt in 1924, the British forces brutally put down a Sudanese rebellion and maintained their grip on power until after the Second World War. But by the late 1940s, a new political system was emerging in Sudan. Sudanese politicians formed parties with a view towards self-governance and autonomy, but these parties had very different views of what this autonomy might mean. There was the militant political wing, which turned toward Egypt and a union with their neighbours to the north outside of British control. And there were the moderates, who formed their own party with the intention of working with the British in a managed transition to independence. The differing approaches of the two parties split the Sudanese people, and the divisions that would later rip the country apart were already beginning to form. The Egyptian government signed an agreement with the British to grant Sudan self-governance within 3 years. This agreement was followed by the national elections later in the year, and the Egyptians, encouraged by his pledges of unity of the Nile Valley and a close relationship with Egypt, backed Ismail al-Azari and his National Unionist Party, or NUP. The NUP won at the polls, dismaying both the British and the more moderate Amma Party. But Egypt would be dismayed too. Al-Azari, eager to avoid a civil conflict within his divided nation, dropped the idea of a union with Egypt. By 1956, Sudan would be a fully independent nation. Al-Azari's efforts were in vain. As independence was declared on New Year's Day, fighting was already underway in the south of the country. The First Sudanese Civil War had already begun, and the fledgling nation was born to a backdrop of bloodshed and terror. During the colonial period, the Anglo-Egyptian condominium had sought to stabilize the country by implementing 2 different administrations, one in the Arab-dominated Islamic north and another in the Christian, African-leaning south. As the British dismantled their colonial structures in Sudan, they failed to recognize this north-south divide. It proved to be a fatal failure. In 1955, appalled by the idea of a consolidation of power in Khartoum, troops in South Sudan mutinied. In the towns of Taurit, Yet, Juba, and Maridi, each home to a military garrison, rebels made their dissent known. Unable to resist the power of troops from the north, the rebels were swiftly overcome but took to the surrounding countryside to continue the fight. While posing little threat to the new government in the north, the units would prove a thorn in the side of al-Azari's new regime, and a military build-up began in South Sudan. While guerrilla troops coalesced in rural areas to the south, the government in the north had other problems to contend with. The NUP had been swept to power in democratic elections, But this power was vulnerable, and the weight of tradition proved far heavier than British important ideals of liberal democracy. A coup in 1958 saw General Ibrahim Aboud seize power, and Sudan lurched rapidly toward authoritarianism. Political parties and assemblies were outlawed, and the military-backed government began a program of national unification, spreading Arab and Islamic influence into the south. But by this point, the mutineers of 1955 were a bit more than just a thorn in the side. What had once been disparate groups of rebels found allies in the student secessionist movement in the south, and the Anyanya group was formed. Far more focused and far better organized, the Anyanya were able to wage a full-scale civil war against the forces of Khartoum beginning in 1962. Perhaps the full might of the Sudanese military could have shattered this rebellion, but protests, uprising, and disagreements in the north proved too great a distraction. People took to the streets to voice their anger at the regime, while a growing leftist influence split the armed forces. A brief civilian coalition under Mohammed Ahmad Mahjoub was created in mid-1965 to attempt to solve some of the issues of representation. However, the same issues of factional disputes reared their heads, and in the end, a coup would again rock the young nation. A new leader would again emerge from the Sudanese armed forces to seize the government in 1969. A group of officers led by Hafar Mohammed El-Nemiri would take power in May of that year. A right-wing insurgency threatened the government of El-Nemiri but was put down. A Marxist coup in 1970 was briefly successful but was overturned, and its leaders executed by El-Nemiri. By the beginning of the new decade, Sudan had already faced 15 years of chaos and conflict. Hundreds of thousands lay dead, and much of the population to the south had been displaced, driven out of their homes by fighting and by the government's heavy-handed attempts at suppression. And the First Sudanese Civil War was still not yet over. In 1971, the Anyanya movement took on a new name. The South Sudanese Liberation Movement, or SSLM, was better equipped, better organized, and better positioned to strike at the forces of the north than anything that had gone before. The SSLM could not defeat the government's forces outright, but they could grind the conflict to a stalemate and drive them to the negotiating table. Finally, in 1972, after 17 years of war and around 500,000 dead, the two sides signed the Addis Ababa Agreement, effectively bringing an end to the conflict and giving autonomy to South Sudan. The agreement appeared to be a huge success for both sides. South Sudan would remain part of Sudan, but would be permitted a separate legislature and would gain the right to self-administration. The soldiers of the SSLM, including those who'd fought with the Anyanya for almost 2 decades, would be integrated into a pan-Sudanese military and security forces. Without the constant drain of civil war on government coffers, the entire nation could begin a process of economic development. For his part in the negotiations, El-Nemiri, now recognized as leader of Sudan, won significant international acclaim. In the end, however, the agreement that promised so much actually delivered very little. Despite being granted autonomy, the population of South Sudan found themselves increasingly marginalized by the government in Khartoum. The agreed upon sharing of power and distribution of resources were only temporary, and a failure to implement the articles of the Addis Ababa Agreement led to increasing disharmony in a country that had only just emerged from a bloody civil war. But there was peace, or relative peace anyway. At the very least, the people of South Sudan could feel safe and secure in their homes. For nearly 140 years, the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo have suffered. From the horrors of colonialism to a series of bloody civil wars via a brutal Western-backed dictatorship, the story of this country in Central Africa is a grim one, but it needs to be told. What we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo has had many names over the past century and a half, but again and again, it has been failed by those who were supposed to be its protectors. both by the so-called peacekeepers of the international community and by the Congolese politicians who promised to lead the nation to prosperity. On this episode of Untangling Africa, we turn our attention to Congo and to one of the most tragic tales in the history of the continent, a tale that is sadly not yet at an end. This is Untangling Africa, and this is the Congo Crisis, where the dream of independence gave way to Africa's longest period of conflict and turmoil. Of the many brutal accounts to emerge from the European colonization of Africa, some of the most barbaric originate from the very heart of the continent, from the Congo Free State. Congo was not a typical European colony. This was no extension of political power or economic policy stretching from Western Europe into the lands of Africa. Instead, this was something different. Congo existed in a personal union with Belgium. A colony not of the state of Belgium, but rather of her ruler, King Leopold II, who took the territory for his own. For 23 years, Leopold did what he wanted with his personal empire. He ran the economy into the ground, brutalized the local population, waged wars, and executed neighboring leaders. Under Leopold's rule, the Congolese were subjected to sickening abuse and persecution. Draconian penalties underpinned law and order, and stories of the armed units of the Force Publique requiring a human hand for every bullet expended to prove the bullet had not been wasted have become part of the fabric of the region's ugly colonial history. Finally, in 1908, Leopold lost control of his personal kingdom, the kingdom he had never personally visited. The Congo Free State was taken over by Belgium, becoming the Belgian Congo and falling into line with other European holdings in the region like German East Africa or the French Congo, exploited, inhibited, but still just about functioning as a state. And yet still, the scars of Leopold were visible upon the land. The ghost of the former personal emperor who had died in 1909 still loomed large. The nation, or nations, of Congo had been broken by Leopold, and the seeds of violence had been sown so abundantly that it was only a matter of time before they burst through the soil and bore fruit. But other seeds had been sown too. In the final years of Leopold's grip on the Congo, the Belgian company Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, also known as the UMHK or the Mining Union of Upper Katanga in English, was granted the exclusive right to mine copper in the Katanga region in the southwest of the Congo. In 1914, as part of the newly formed colony of the Belgian Congo, Katanga would gain province status, becoming an economic powerhouse for the state. 33.7% of the total revenue of Congo came from copper mining in Katanga, which was controlled exclusively by the UMHK. Even after Congo was absorbed into Belgium's empire, the legacy of Leopold II remained in the form of the mining interests granted during his personal rule. And even after Congo gained independence in 1960, the Belgian government would be reluctant to give up its stake in such a lucrative enterprise. The UMHK had regional power, it had money, it had the backing of Europe. To say the Second World War hit Europe hard is a massive understatement. The continent was crippled by the conflict that ripped through it from 1939 to 1945, and in the decades that followed, those countries that still held lingering colonial power struggled to keep it together. One of those countries was Belgium, and this had a significant effect on the political landscape of the Belgian Congo. By the 1950s, change was in the air, and revolution was being discussed in alarmingly real terms. As the decade progressed, colonial administrators found themselves struggling to contain the fire of local dissent. When the government back in Belgium turned up the pressure, local administrators began to manipulate the facts until flashpoints and violent incidents simply went unreported. The Belgian Congo was spiraling toward chaos, but Belgium herself remained blissfully unaware of the true gravity of the situation. On January 4th, 1959, Belgium became very, very aware. Rioting broke out in the colony's capital, Leopoldville, another legacy of the former king. 34 Congolese were killed after an attempted meeting of the anti-colonial political party Alliance des Congo, or ABCO, was broken up by Belgian forces. The bloodshed in the capital lit the fuse for revolution across the country. Flashpoints grew in frequency, and the Belgian administrators, their hands tied by the bureaucratic process, could not effectively punish those involved. This emboldened the local masses, and when the Parti Solidaire Africain emerged in May 1959, it rapidly gained support. The Belgian government now had a simple choice: either give the people the elections they craved or lose control of the region altogether. But even at this late stage, the colonial authorities had more tricks up their sleeve. They called an election but backed their own puppet candidates in an attempt to placate the people. The Parti Solidaire Africain, now allied with the ABCO, was outraged, and this meant the people were outraged too. A boycott was called. The Belgians responded by arresting men who refused to vote, but their efforts were in vain. Turnout among white Belgians was high, but in Congolese areas it was woeful. In the Kwilu region, a little more than 1% of those eligible actually voted in the populated Kwilu district, while voting numbers were somewhat higher elsewhere. Belgium was forced back to the negotiation table with its tail between its legs. New elections were called. This time, they would be fair and free, and the Parti Solidaire Africain would be involved. There was only one outcome, and on June 30th, 1960, Congo declared independence from Belgium. From the private plaything of a European king, to an official colony, to an independent state, all in a little over half a century, but still the strife and violence that had plagued Congo for so long refused to go away. The cracks in the new state began to form almost immediately. Up to now, we've talked about the people of the Congo as a homogeneous whole, but in truth, this is far, far too simplistic. There are more than 200 distinct ethnic groups inhabiting the vast Congo region, each with its own culture, history, and outlook. This enormous diversity fractured the Parti Solidaire Africain, and local disagreements effectively killed the party right on the cusp of a new age. According to the journalist David Reed, reporting from Congo for the US News and World Report, the dream of independence and autonomy for those who had lived through decades of colonial oppression quickly died. African officials suddenly were big shots, rode around in fancy cars, and took over elaborate homes, Reed wrote. In short, they replaced a white aristocracy with a black aristocracy. But there was more to come. The Force Publique had provided the military power in the region since the days of Leopold II, and even in the days following independence, consisted of black Congolese soldiers serving under white Belgian officers. When the African soldiers of the Belgian officered Force Publique saw what was happening, Reed added, they wanted their share. On July 8th, barely a week after independence, they mutinied and a fresh crisis erupted. Belgium, desperate to evacuate their citizens amid reports of violence and retribution from soldiers and civilians alike, sent in special forces units to bring Belgians back to Europe. Not all Belgians were so quick to abandon Congo, however. The UMHK still controlled the mining copper in the southern province of Katanga, and the UMHK in turn was controlled by European interests, chiefly Belgian interests, but also British and French too. The lure of mineral wealth, of money, proved strong. The UMHK and its European backers began to conspire, working with a local Katangan politician to protect their massive investment in the south of the new nation. This politician was Moise Tshombe, a man who has since become synonymous with the unfolding Congo Crisis. On July 11th, less than 2 weeks after independence and only 3 days after the Force Publique mutiny, Tshombe announced the formation of another state, the independent state of Katanga. Belgium, France, and the United Kingdom did not publicly acknowledge this new state, but this did not stop them from backing Katanga financially and militarily. Flouting UN regulations, European soldiers even joined Tshombe's army as mercenaries. In a matter of weeks, Congo had already begun to disintegrate, and Katanga, with powerful European friends, looked like it would be sticking around. History is never simple. To write Katanga's secession off as a purely financial move, a power play from neocolonialists in Brussels, Paris, and London, is just too easy. Was Tshombe simply a puppet for a new form of economic imperialism? Francis Terry McNamara, who served as an officer at the US consul in Elizabethville, also known as Lubumbashi in Katanga during the crisis, didn't think so. Tshombe was a man of great charm and intelligence, a good leader. The idea that he was just a creature of neocolonial influences is a gross exaggeration and misunderstanding of fact, McNamara said in a 1993 interview. Like most African political leaders, his support was tribally based. He openly opposed the central government. In the beginning, he was manipulated to a degree by the Belgians, the French, and the British, but they didn't create his authentic local rapport. People's only real identification is still with tribe and region. Congo is an artificial creation of the colonial powers. European nations protecting their business interests, local ethnic and tribal groups dissatisfied with the new Congolese order. McNamara's words really highlight the complexity of the situation here in Central Africa at the beginning of the 1960s. But this complexity doesn't end here. Along with tribal divisions, there were ideological divisions too, which would put Congo at the heart of simmering international tensions. The independent Congo state had been declared after democratic elections and the reluctant agreement of the former colonial powers. In the eyes of the world, this was a legitimate nation, one that deserved the support and assistance afforded to other nations with a seat at the table of the United Nations. Patrice Lumumba, a democratically elected prime minister of the fledgling country under President Joseph Kasavubu, appealed to the UN for help in ending Katangan secession and halting the slide toward all-out war. When the UN refused, Lumumba made a decision that would cost him his office and ultimately his life, and would add a whole new international dimension to the conflict. He turned to the Soviet Union. Lumumba never referred to himself as a socialist or a communist. He was an African nationalist at heart, and avowedly so. But by looking to the USSR at the time of enormous tension between the West and the communist bloc, Lumumba's actions spoke louder than his words. After a string of communist victories in Asia, the West was not about to let a vast swath of Central Africa fall under the influence of Moscow. In one sense, Lumumba's gamble paid off. The UN and the United States, alarmed by the idea of Soviet weapons in an African civil war, sprung into action. In February, the UN passed Security Council Resolution 161, authorizing all appropriate measures to prevent civil war in the country. Attempts by the UN to find a diplomatic solution to the crisis were dealt a crushing blow that September when Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld's plane crashed in suspicious circumstances in Zambia, on its way to a secret rendezvous with Tshombe, killing all on board. The green light was essentially lit for international military action in Katanga. The Katangan state, even with its unofficial European mercenaries, could not hold out. By January 1963, Katanga's secession was quashed, and Tshombe rejoined Kasavubu's government as prime minister later in 1964. In almost all other senses though, Lumumba's gamble did not pay off, not even close. Lumumba was deposed as Prime Minister of Congo in November 1960 after only months in office. He would not live to see UN intervention in his country as he was murdered in custody in 1961 before Resolution 161 had passed. The death of Patrice Lumumba has been the source of much controversy and conjecture. What's almost certain is this. On January 17th, the deposed Prime Minister, along with 2 associates, faced a firing squad on the grounds of a private villa in Katanga. The 3 men were shot to death, their bodies buried in shallow graves before being exhumed, dismembered, and dissolved in sulfuric acid. What's less certain is how this came about. Belgian officials likely oversaw the execution while Katangan authorities likely carried it out. At the same time, it is known that CIA agents made attempts on Lumumba's life in the period of tumult following his election, while a memo from the British Foreign Office suggested removing Lumumba from the scene by killing him. Whatever involvement outside elements had in Lumumba's death, by 1965, the Civil War was declared over and Congo was unified under a new leader. The age of Mobutu had begun. Africa has been a hotbed of conflict for the last century. As the colonial regimes of the Old World withered, the shadow of the Cold War enveloped the continent. Vast natural resources were discovered and weapons proliferated, providing the means for idealists and renegades to take power for themselves. This is Untangling Africa, and in this episode, we're examining the Guinea-Bissau War of Independence, Portugal's Vietnam. Africa has 3 Guineas. One used to be French and is now called Guinea, another used to be Spanish and is now called Equatorial Guinea, and the third, the subject of this video, was ruled by Portugal. It's now called Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau has a 500-year history of Portuguese domination, and by the 1950s, it was a backwater. The reclusive dictator António de Oliveira Salazar ran Portugal, and his administration wasn't all that interested in the old colonial empire. Investment in Guinea-Bissau was minimal, and the country's governor didn't even know how many people he governed. Infrastructure was neglected and roads were unpaved, meaning schools and clinics were inaccessible for most. In 1950, 99% of the population was illiterate. Epidemics, particularly sleeping sickness, often swept the nation, killing thousands. Small-scale resistance movements had popped up throughout Guinea-Bissau's colonial history, but none had been particularly successful. One man believed he could change that: Amilcar Cabral. An agronomist by training, Cabral became an activist while studying in Lisbon. He strongly opposed Portugal's dictatorship and promoted the independence of Portugal's overseas territories. Upon his return home, he founded the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, shortened to PAIGC, alongside fellow activist Rafael Barbosa. Their activities started peacefully, with demonstrations, but it wasn't long before things turned violent. On August 3, 1959, dock workers in Bissau's port went on strike. Extremely low wages left them unable to provide for their families, and the Portuguese company that owned the docks refused to negotiate. The police were called and they arrived ready for a fight. When the men refused to work, the police hurled several grenades and opened fire. The strikers scattered, with many jumping into the water to escape. They were shot as they tried to swim away. Between 25 and 50 workers died on scene, while many more were seriously wounded. The incident, which became known as the Pijigiti Massacre, demonstrated to the whole of Guinea-Bissau that the Portuguese tolerated no dissent and were willing to shoot unarmed people to maintain control. Cabral knew about the strike as it was being planned and lent it PAIGC's support, but wasn't directly involved. This didn't matter to the police. They blamed the bloodshed on PAIGC anyway. Cabral and his activists felt they had just one option left. If the Portuguese were committed to violence, then so were they. PAIGC relocated its headquarters to Conakry, the capital of neighbouring Guinea, in 1960. Here, Cabral gathered strength and readied his forces. A pact was made between PAIGC and forces fighting for the independence of Angola, Mozambique, and the island nation of São Tomé and Príncipe. All were Portuguese colonies, like Guinea-Bissau, and all were committed to fighting the Portuguese for independence. Together, they established the Conference of Nationalist Organizations of the Portuguese Colonies, CONCP, to champion their interests to the rest of the world. Cabral also declared the PAIGC to be Marxist, winning them considerable support from the communist bloc. The war started in January 1963 when PAIGC guerrillas attacked a Portuguese garrison at Tite. Other towns in southern Guinea-Bissau with Portuguese military presences were attacked soon after. The colonials tried to hit back, but it was a nightmare. Guinea-Bissau's geography was ideal for guerrilla warfare. Thick jungle, deep rivers, and a dispersed population made it very easy for PAIGC fighters to slip away before the Portuguese could bring heavier weapons to bear. This was one area where they possessed a decisive advantage, as At this stage, most PAIGC platoons had no more than one pre-World War II rifle or SMG and a handful of pistols to go around. If PAIGC fighters were masters of the jungle, the Portuguese were masters of the air. Their response to PAIGC raids was bombing campaigns against villages thought to be harboring the enemy. Hundreds of settlements were destroyed, often on no more evidence than a vague suspicion. 500,000 people were displaced and fled across the border into Guinea. Those who wanted revenge were only too welcome in the ranks of the PAIGC. Attacks ramped up at the end of 1963, with Cabral even declaring the islands around Como free from colonial control. This finally caught the attention of the government in Lisbon, which, until this point, hadn't taken the independence movement in Guinea-Bissau seriously. Salazar approved a troop surge, and before long, 35,000 Portuguese troops were in country. They launched Operation Tridente in January 1964 with the goal of annihilating the rebels in Guinea-Bissau's southern coastal region around modern-day Catió. It was believed that Cabral had a major base in the area, so the Portuguese went all in trying to destroy it. Marines landed on the beach and secured strategic points. All farm produce in the area was burned, livestock were shot, and villages were bombed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. A few isolated skirmishes were fought, and the rebels managed to shoot down a T-6 Texan fighter plane with rifle fire, but otherwise, things were quiet. Many Portuguese found the environment unbearable and just wanted to smash the rebels and move on. They were trying to fight a conventional war against an unconventional enemy. By April 1964, Portuguese forces had withdrawn from Como. It was soon back under PAIGC control, and Cabral's forces helped the villagers replace their lost livestock. Though technically a Portuguese victory, Operation Tridente became a propaganda coup for Cabral. Armed with stories of burning villages and starving people, Cabral asked the international community for help. Cuba was quick to support him and sent several army medical units as well as other specialists to fill capability gaps. The Soviet Union also took pity on the neglected nation, choosing to send crates of Kalashnikovs and RPGs. In 1965, 75 Bissau Guineans were enrolled in a guerrilla warfare training course in Soviet Ukraine, while a cadre of women were trained as nurses elsewhere in the USSR. Generous supplies of ammunition and additional weapons were sent with warm regards from the People's Republic of China. A great deal of the logistics behind this international support was organized by the Guinean government. They were ideologically aligned with Cabral's cause and, at the expense of their own security, committed to helping the movement however they could. With weapons and official support from the communist bloc, the PAIGC's ranks swelled. This put pressure on their food supplies, however, as Cabral was especially keen to avoid taking too much from locals. His solution was agronomy. He trained a detachment of farmers in agronomy and sent them out alongside the guerrillas. When they moved into a new village, Cabral's men would teach the locals new farming techniques and give them modern tools, thereby increasing agricultural output. It didn't matter then that the guerrillas had to take more from the locals, because now the locals had much more to give. This was part of a broader Hearts and Minds campaign to win Bissau Guineans over to PAIGC's cause. Alongside the brutal suppression of other independence groups, such as the Struggle Front for the National Independence of Guinea, whose members were murdered when they refused to switch allegiance to the PAIGC, the campaign worked. By the mid-1960s, PAIGC was the most powerful independent force in Guinea-Bissau. Growing international support for the rebels legitimized the conflict and worried Lisbon. By 1968, losing Guinea-Bissau to a hostile government had become a real possibility. To remedy the situation, they deployed General Antonio de Espinola and began a new campaign. Instead of burning villages and shooting cattle, Portugal would try to win the locals over by being nice. General Espinola started by building roads, schools, and clinics in outlying areas. He also overhauled the colonial administration to make it much less discriminatory toward local Bissau Guineans and kick-started a massive recruiting drive. Africans were welcomed into the colonial military and some even became officers, something previously unheard of. Their flagship unit was the African Commandos, a cool-sounding force led exclusively by black officers. It was believed by the Portuguese that these men would make better jungle fighters, and they might have done, but they couldn't hold a flame to the highly experienced and battle-hardened fighters of the PAIGC. The rebels thought of the African colonial soldiers as cannon fodder. The last of General Espinola's changes was the Portuguese plan of attack. Targeted raids against rebel supply bases replaced grand maneuvers, and intelligence agents began collecting data on PAIGC's leaders. As the founder of the movement, Cabral was an obvious target, but he was also increasingly in the international spotlight. He closed a deal with Sweden for medical aid in 1969, and Sweden quickly became PAIGC's most important non-military backer. They were particularly impressed with Cabral's competence in leading the liberation struggle, but this posed a threat to the Portuguese. They went after him in November 1970 as part of Operation Sea Green. 420 colonial marines stormed ashore into the Guinean capital of Conakry. Their objective was to destroy PAIGC landing ships, rescue POWs, overthrow Guinea's government, and neutralize Cabral. The first two objectives were achieved swiftly, but overthrowing the government proved to be a bigger job than they'd planned for. Most of Guinea's officials managed to escape, and Cabral was actually away in Europe during the operation. Nevertheless, the Portuguese chalked it up as a win and withdrew. Maybe they knew what was coming. Cabral was assassinated by revolutionary rival Inocêncio Cani and another PAIGC member on January 20th, 1973. It's still not clear if Lisbon was involved, but it's a little too convenient for them not to have been. In response, PAIGC's allies stepped up their efforts. The Soviets began supplying the rebels with brand new Strela 2 shoulder-mounted heat-seeking missiles. These were a game changer. By 1973, guerrilla activity kept the Portuguese restricted to major towns and fortified bases, but their air power still posed a significant threat. Now, however, the rebels could shoot down aircraft without exposing themselves, effectively grounding the Portuguese colonial air force. With their air power grounded, the Portuguese were besieged within their bases. In September, the PAIGC declared Guinea-Bissau's independence, and it was generally recognized internationally. Lisbon vowed to fight on, but Salazar's regime was toppled in the Carnation Revolution before he could follow through on the threat. Portugal's new regime granted Guinea-Bissau its full independence on September 24, 1974, ending the 11-and-a-half-year war. The conflicts of Yemen are too often forgotten by the world. There have been so many, one right after the other, and we've reached a point where none of us have been alive during a time of peace. As the war, which started all the way back in 2014, rages on, it's important to look at Yemen's history to understand where it all started. When you look at a map of today's conflict in Yemen, you can see a very distinct divide between who controls the north and south. That's because, until 1990, Yemen was divided into two countries, and the conflict we see today draws a lot of similarities from the North Yemen Civil War of the 1960s, when the country was divided by two contrasting ideologies for Islamic governance. In this video, we're going to dive into the North Yemen Civil War and discover why this conflict shouldn't be forgotten. The Ottomans controlled Yemen when it was split between North and South in 1904, where North Yemen was ruled by the Ottomans and South Yemen was ruled by the British. However, following the First World War and the complete dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, North Yemen found itself independent and became an Islamic state ruled by imams. North Yemen only had 3 imams in total before it fell. The first imam of the fragile state was Imam Yahya Hamiduddin, who ruled until his assassination in 1948. He was succeeded by his son, Imam Ahmad bin Yahya. Ahmad bin Yahya was, in comparison to his father, a modernist. He worked toward modernizing the country, including reversing his father's ban on aircraft, and even worked toward more international engagement. However, he continued his father's draconian methods on law and order and remained essentially an autocrat retaining control over even minor decisions throughout the kingdom. Despite his advances and family lineage, Yahya was deeply unpopular. During his time on the throne, a massive wave of Arab nationalism was sweeping through the Middle East and North Africa, started by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose dream was to unite all Arab countries into one massive pan-Arab state. Nasser tried hard to make his dream a reality and established the United Arab Republic in February 1958, which initially consisted of Egypt and Syria. A month later, Imam Ahmad bin Yahya went to Damascus to bring Yemen into the fold. In exchange, he wanted to maintain his tenuous grip on the nation. To the people of North Yemen, being part of the United Arab Republic should have meant that they could be rid of their malevolent ruler. The Imam was ruthless, even being called medieval by his contemporaries, as he ordered decapitations and amputations for any dissidents. His laws were arbitrary and inconsistent, and the people suffered under him, and he was subjected to many attempted coups and assassinations. During one such attempt, multiple army officers emptied their revolvers into his body at point-blank range, only for the Imam to survive. Having grown up watching his grandfather and father rule, Muhammad al-Badr knew it would someday be his place to lead North Yemen. Al-Badr, however, was drawn to the growing wave of nationalism and modernism gripping the Arab world. Even though al-Badr was a huge admirer of Nasser's ideologies and began bringing in Egyptian experts to help modernize Yemen as early as 1959, it wasn't enough to squash the people's vitriol toward the royals. And none of this was lost on Yemen's once ally, Egypt. Even Nasser himself wanted to dispose of the royal family in Yemen. In January 1962, he began supporting the Free Yemen movement, a nationalist organization dedicated to throwing out the regime. He gave them money, an office, and even airtime on the radio to spread their ideology. Nasser wanted to be rid of the royals of North Yemen and the British of South Yemen so he could maintain his status as a leader in the Arab world, a reputation he was losing due to the fact that the United Arab Republic was already unraveling. And as nationalist ideology spread further within Yemen, there was no shortage of groups vying for control over the fledgling nation. There had already been an assassination attempt on Imam Ahmad in June 1961, which left the ruler crippled. But he held on until September 1962 when he died in his sleep. After his father's death, Crown Prince Muhammad al-Badr became the Imam. It was barely a week later, on September 25th, when al-Badr began hearing shelling outside the royal palace and saw tanks advancing. And he was shocked to see the man he had personally appointed to be the commander of the royal guard, Abdullah al-Salal, leading the attack on his home. And he wasn't acting alone. He was leading a coup that included police, military, and even students from the military academy. The revolutionaries battled the palace guard, still loyal to the Imam, and the fighting stretched all through the night, with tanks in the street and artillery firing incessantly. The revolutionaries took over the palace armory, secured the radio station, and advanced further into the palace grounds. When it became obvious there was no winning the fight, Imam al-Badr escaped through the garden at the back of his palace with his personal servants. By early the following morning, the revolutionaries had won, and come late morning, they had the entire palace secured and made a radio broadcast announcing that the regime had been overthrown and the new government, run by the revolutionaries, was now in charge. The Mutawakkilat Kingdom of Yemen was now the Yemen Arab Republic, and Salal was its president. Within the next couple of days, rumors began to fly around that al-Badr was dead, but Salal knew he wasn't. Knowing that there were still royalists in the country, he gave them a warning, saying, "The corrupt monarchy which ruled for 1,000 years was a disgrace to the Arab nation and to all humanity. Anyone who tries to restore it is an enemy of God and man." By September 28th, al-Badr was confirmed to be in neighboring Saudi Arabia, where the royal family there was sympathetic to his plight. Nasser and his government were very happy with the success of the coup, and on September 29th, he sent a battalion of his special forces to Yemen's capital of Sana'a to act as Salah's personal guard. He also sent Egyptian General Ali Abdul Hamid to work with the Yemeni Revolutionary Command Council and assess what they needed so they could lend more support. The presence of the Egyptian military in Sana'a made the Saudis nervous as they feared invasion of their country, so they sent troops in to guard the border between the two countries. By early October, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia was already sending weapons to royalist tribes in the northern region of Yemen, and conflict seemed inevitable. They had remained loyal to the Imam because they were primarily Shia Muslim, just like al-Badr, and in 1963 alone, Saudi Arabia supplied them with $15 million worth of weapons. The Imam had the support of the ambassadors from London, Bonn, Amman, and Washington, D.C., whereas Salal had his support from Cairo, Belgrade, Rome, and Moscow. In fact, the Soviet Union was all in on Salal, and Nikita Khrushchev himself said that any act of aggression against Yemen will be considered an act of aggression against the Soviet Union. From there, the diplomatic negotiations started. The president of the US at the time, John F. Kennedy, was very wary of violence breaking out in Yemen as it had the potential to spread across the Middle East. He sent notes to both sides advising that Nasser should withdraw his troops and Faisal should stop supplying arms to the royalists. Nasser agreed, but only on the condition that Saudi Arabia and Jordan, who were also supplying weapons, stop all aggressive operations on the frontiers. Saudi Arabia and Jordan did not agree to this, not because they wanted an armed conflict in Yemen, but because they didn't trust Nasser to actually withdraw his troops. The Saudis were afraid that if Nasser had unfettered access to Yemen, he would then come for Saudi Arabia and its oil. And the Jordanians feared that if Nasser got his hands on Saudi Arabia, they would be next. The two countries asked the United States not to officially recognize Salal and his government, stressing that the Imam would come back into power. The US held off as long as it could, but due to international pressure, it gave in and became the 34th country to formally recognize the Yemen Arab Republic on December 19, 1962. The next day, the United Nations followed suit and considered the Republic to be the only authority in Yemen. The only major world power that didn't recognize Salal's government was Britain, which still held on to a colony in South Yemen called Aden. The British were afraid of Nasser's presence in North Yemen because they feared an Arab coalition which may threaten their hold over the territory. They needn't have worried though, because the people of South Yemen were very capable of freeing themselves. To learn more about the Aden Emergency that ended the British colony, check out our previous video on the topic. All countries involved in the conflict in North Yemen tried to solve it through diplomacy for the following 6 months, but none of their efforts were successful. Nasser would not pull out his troops and the Saudis would not stop supplying weapons to the royalists. Soon enough, the violence started. By the beginning of 1963, the number of Egyptian troops in North Yemen had risen from 12,000 to 28,000, with a good number of Soviet bloc personnel joining them. And to help supplement the ground troops, Egypt also began sending in fighter bombers, with some going to the Saudi-Yemeni border and others to the northwest coast, where they began operating airstrikes. The Egyptian troops first worked feverishly in October and November of 1962 to stem the royalist advances in the northern portion of the nation, successfully doing so by the end of November when they took the city of Sada from the royalists. They then began working to secure major routes leading in and out of the capital Sanana, as well as the major cities of Taiz and Hodeidah. This phase of the war, characterized by counterinsurgency operations, would become known as the Ramadan Offensive. It started in February 1963 when a task force comprised of 15 tanks, 18 trucks, 20 armored cars, and a number of jeeps took off from Sanana and headed north to a town called Sada near the border to Saudi Arabia, with more garrison troops following behind. They moved from town to town, occupying territory wherever they could, but not without resistance. During one battle, 500 royalists spent a week fighting the Egyptians on a sheer-sided hill 25 miles or 40 kilometers outside of Sanana. With all their fancy new weapons given to them by Faisal, they were able to kill 160 Egyptian soldiers along with 3 tanks and 7 armored cars. Despite their heroic resistance, the royalists lost strategic territory that limited their supply runs. They eventually found a way around this loss by using camels instead of trucks to move supplies through the mountainous northern regions while avoiding towns held by the Egyptians. By doing this, they were able to strengthen their armies, and slowly they began to recover areas previously lost to the Republican fighters. This sort of tug of war, losing and then regaining territory with neither side really having the upper hand, continued for more than a year and a half before any negotiations took place. In September 1964, Nasser and Faisal met in Alexandria for the Arab Summit. There, both sides agreed that they didn't want any more violence. By that time, Egypt had 40,000 troops in Yemen and had already lost an estimated 10,000 others. Both Nasser and Faisal had officially agreed to cooperate with each other, stop the armed conflict in Yemen, and come to a peaceful solution. Their talks went well. So well, in fact, that they were widely praised across the Arab world, and the United States even called them a major step toward an eventual peaceful settlement of the long civil war. Even Faisal left Egypt feeling good, saying that his heart was brimming with love for President Nasser. Following this successful peace talks, a secret conference was held in Sudan on November 2nd, during which the Royalists and Republicans both agreed to a ceasefire that would go into effect on the 6th, less than a week later. 9 representatives on each side of the conflict worked out the terms of the ceasefire, with representatives from Egypt and Saudi Arabia overseeing the negotiations. The next phase was for the 168 tribal leaders in Yemen to get together for a conference on November 23rd. The plan was to name provisional national executives made up of 2 Republicans, 2 Royalists, and 1 neutral party. From there, they would run the country temporarily to plan a vote which would determine whether to continue running the country as a republic or go back to the royal system of imams. But before the conference could happen, and for reasons which are still unclear, the Egyptians resumed their bombings of royalist territories. The conference was initially pushed to November 30th, but as violence engulfed the region once more, the conference was postponed indefinitely. This time, the Royalists, who had previously focused on counteroffensives, began more proactive measures to try and drive out the Egyptians. To accomplish this, they set to cutting off the Egyptian lines of communication within Yemen. The Egyptians had a web of communication spread out across the country that avoided much of the mountains, which the Royalists controlled. The plan was to capture garrisons along the communications lines and thus prevent further Egyptian movement. They worked with the Num tribe, who pretended to align with the Egyptians and gave the Royalists time to occupy 2 mountains surrounding one of their targets in exchange for first dibs on looting the garrison when they were done. They set up 75mm guns and mortars and aimed them right at the garrison. They then launched a surprise attack, during which they opened fire on the Egyptians, and the people of the Num tribe jumped out from behind the rocks to attack. The attack was successful, and in no time at all, they had some of the Egyptian troops surrendering and the rest fleeing. The Royalists had similar success at other garrisons as well, but by June 1965, the Royalists had lost some 40,000 men, significantly more than Egypt, which had lost a little more than 15,000. Despite the recent Royalist success, the Egyptians just wouldn't back down, and the 2 sides eventually reached a stalemate. That stalemate was rather costly for Egypt, who lost $500,000 a day to the war. In a speech to his people in 1965, Nasser said, "We're facing difficulties. We must work harder and make sacrifices. I have no magic button that I can push to produce the things we want." To try and help pay for the war without increasing the $3 billion of foreign debt that they were already facing, Nasser increased income tax and tariffs on non-essential imports and imposed a defense tax on all sales. But even with the additional money and additional troops, there were now 60,000 Egyptian troops in Yemen, and even with launching the largest offensive of the war yet, they couldn't break the stalemate. Further peace talks between Nasser and Faisal occurred the same year, and within 48 hours of meeting in Jeddah, the two had agreed to the gradual withdrawal of Egyptian troops over a 10-month period and the cessation of Saudi support to the Royalists. But just like the peace talks from the year before, nothing came of this agreement, and the state of war continued. No matter the new strategy, the new money, or the new troops, the war pressed on and went nowhere. Not even a chemical attack on behalf of the Egyptians, although they deny it, in January 1967 that killed 140 people and injured another 270 could tip the scales. As 1967 wore on, Egypt was hemorrhaging money just to keep funding a war it was neither winning nor losing. The previous economic measures they had put in place to help foot the bill were no longer enough, so they added more. Taxes for middle and upper class citizens were increased, along with workers' monthly compulsory savings, which went up by 50%. On top of that, Nasser cut overtime pay, reduced the national sugar ration by a third, and halted all major industrial programs. And Yemen wasn't the only conflict the Egyptian military was wrapped up in. In June 1967, they lost 15,000 troops in the Six-Day War fought against Israel. To try and make up for their losses, they pulled 15,000 troops out of Yemen. With all this strain, Egypt couldn't hold much longer. In the wake of the Six-Day War, the Khartoum Resolution was issued. The document mostly covered peace efforts between Egypt and Israel, but Egypt also used it as a way to announce they were finally ready to end the war in North Yemen. Nasser reached out to Faisal and proposed they revive the Jeddah peace agreement from 2 years previous, which Faisal was happy to adhere to. They both signed a formal treaty, with Egypt promising to withdraw its remaining 20,000 troops and Saudi Arabia promising to halt its funding of the royalists. This time, each side stuck to its word. Salal was furious with Nasser and accused him of betrayal. He wasn't done fighting and he needed Nasser's support. Without it, his popularity among his troops took a nosedive and they began turning on him. There were 2 bazooka attacks on the palace, and Salal either fired or ordered the executions of several people in his cabinet. It was obvious that his hold on the country was becoming loose, so when he visited Nasser in Cairo later that year, Nasser advised him to go into exile, which he refused to do. Until the coup, that is. Nasser ordered his remaining troops not to interfere in any attempted coup, which was all but inevitable. The inevitable occurred on November 5th, when royalist forces, completely unopposed by Egyptian troops, surrounded the palace complex in Sana'a, leading to what would be known as the Siege of Sana'a in 1967. The Republic persisted instead of reverting back to the Imamites, and the new government was now headed by 3 of Salal's former cabinet members. The political heat in Yemen was too hot though, and they soon fled the country, leaving behind Prime Minister Hassan al-Amri to be in charge of things. Though Egypt and Saudi Arabia had left, the war went on for 3 more years as the royalists refused to give in, and they fought until their remaining supplies ran dry. In 1970, Saudi Arabia formally recognized North Yemen as the Yemeni Arab Republic, bringing forth a formal end to the war. The Republicans and the remaining royalists signed a ceasefire, and the Republicans had officially won the war. In exchange for signing the ceasefire, the Saudi government gave North Yemen a grant of 20 million. Around the same time, South Yemen had finally kicked out the British and was in the process of forming its own country. North and South Yemen had a short border war in 1972, which ended with both sides agreeing to unite, a process that wouldn't conclude until 1990. Though the North Yemen Civil War had officially ended, violence never really stopped in that pocket of the world. Between North and South Yemen, and now Yemen as a whole, one conflict has just bled into the next, over and over again, with much of the world, whether purposely or not, turning a blind eye. We hope that things eventually change. The Second World War was an unprecedented shake of the snow globe, and as such, it makes sense that it would be followed by a period of unrest. This came primarily in the form of the Cold War, in which the world was sundered into East and West, and under which there took place a great many terrible, bloody conflicts. Another development set in motion by World War II was the decolonisation of Africa, and one of the, let's say, less peaceful decolonisation movements was what came to be known as the Rhodesian Bush War, which was far from unsullied by Cold War politics. But just what was Rhodesia and just what was the Bush War? In this episode of The Front, you're going to find that out. Established in 1923, Southern Rhodesia was a self-governed British colony in southern, not South, Africa. After World War II, Southern Rhodesia's white European minority decided they wanted the colony to become a sovereign state over which they would have control. Britain was willing to grant Southern Rhodesia its independence, but it only wanted to do so if the state met the conditions of majority rule, meaning that the white minority could not have absolute control. In response, directed by white Prime Minister Ian Smith, the white minority did all it could to delay the inevitable, making a unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI, and stripping the Southern from Southern Rhodesia in November 1965. But most of the rest of the world never recognized it as an official state. Even before the UDI, however, tensions in and around Rhodesia were high, with the first notable act of violence of the Bush War occurring in July the year before. Before we get into that, let's lay out the belligerents. In opposition to Smith's white minority-led government were two African nationalist organisations and their guerrilla arms, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, and its guerrilla arm ZIPRA, and the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, and its guerrilla arm ZANLA. In respect to the climate of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a major supporter of ZAPU, while China was a major supporter of ZANU, which also maintained strong ties with the Mozambique Liberation Front, or FRELIMO. By 1979, ZAPU and ZANU boasted a combined might of 45,000, though it's important to note that these organisations went toe-to-toe with each other on more occasions than one. As for Smith, he enjoyed overt support, including war supplies, material and troops from South Africa, though as the Bush War progressed, overseas volunteers from Portugal, the United States and even Britain, to just name a few, fought in the Rhodesian security forces. By 1979, the Rhodesian security forces had grown to some 10,800 regulars, with around 40,000 military and police reservists at their calling. Lastly, back in 1973, it's estimated that between 2,000 and 5,000 South African troops were fighting for Smith's white minority-led government. Back to July 1964, it was ZANU guerrillas who broke the ice and set the Bush War in motion, murdering a prominent white foreman and his wife. In retaliation, Smith had both ZANU and ZAPU leaders detained, and in retaliation to this, ZANU guerrillas operating out of Zambia started attacking Rhodesia. After Rhodesia's UDI, things escalated and Britain imposed an embargo on the unrecognised state. While this did limit the Rhodesian security forces' ability to make war, support from South Africa kept them in the fight. From 1964 to 1972, the Rhodesian security forces were able to knock back the guerrillas operating out of Zambia with relative ease, utilising a series of military camps set up along the Zambezi River. Though, things escalated near the end of 1972 when ZANU guerrillas inflicted major damage on Altina Tobacco Farm, which was owned by a white farmer who was wounded in the attack. After this, the Rhodesian security forces started conducting offensive operations into Zambia, Portuguese-ruled Mozambique, and Tanzania, trying to preemptively nullify their opposition. Guerrilla activity increased in turn. Things got much worse for Rhodesia after Mozambique gained its independence from Portugal in 1945. Earlier, we mentioned how ZANU had strong ties with the Mozambique Liberation Front, or FRELIMO. Now, it was them, FRELIMO, who ruled Mozambique, and this essentially opened Rhodesia up to a war on three fronts. From Zambia, Mozambique, and Botswana and South Africa, out of which ZANU and ZAPU guerrillas and ZANU-aligned South African guerrillas operated, not to mention the fighting which took place in Rhodesia itself. It's safe to say that Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith was starting to sweat at this point, and what made matters worse for Smith was that his most stalwart ally, South Africa, was starting to back out. The decolonisation of Africa was in full effect, and the majority rule was on his doorstep. Yet, over the next 4 or so years, Smith never wholly gave up. He even started letting black volunteers into the Rhodesian security forces, so many so that, by 1976, the force was majority black, and he also resorted to some pretty questionable methods of war. One of Smith's most astounding last-ditch efforts was the Rhodesian Security Forces chemical and biological weapons program, in which they used insecticides, rodenticides, cholera, anthrax, typhus, typhoid fever, and other toxins to kill African nationalist guerrillas. They achieved this by contaminating food, beverages, and medicines in guerrilla camps in Rhodesia, Zambia, and Mozambique. Overall, the CBW program resulted in just over 800 recorded deaths. Trumping the CBW program, in August 1976, 72 operatives of the Sela Scouts, a special forces unit of the Rhodesian Security Forces, disguised themselves in FRELIMO uniforms and vehicles and drove into Mozambique. Reaching a ZANU camp, they announced to the 4,000 guerrillas resting there that Rhodesia had been won. When the guerrillas came out to celebrate, the scouts opened fire, gunning down between 300 and 1,000 guerrillas before fleeing. From here on in, ZAPU and ZANU grew and, supported by the Eastern Bloc, gained access to better training and equipment. but the Bush War wasn't silenced just yet. In May 1977, the Rhodesian security forces engaged ZANU forces in Mozambique with ground and air forces, taking 32 guerrilla lives for a loss of just one pilot. In August, ZANU bombed a Woolworths department store in Rhodesia's capital, Salisbury, killing 11 and injuring a further 70. Later that year, ZANU burned the homes of black civilians living on white-owned farms on Rhodesia, ending 16 black lives in smoke and flame. In November, the Rhodesian security forces made another combined arms attack, codenamed Operation Dingo, on guerrilla camps in Mozambique over a 3-day period, ending thousands of lives. In May 1978, 50 civilians were killed in the crossfire of yet another battle, and some 450 ZANU guerrillas stormed the town of Umtali in Mozambique. In retaliation, the Rhodesians conducted a series of aerial raids on guerrilla encampments. In September, the Rhodesian security forces flew fighter bombers and gunships to the ZAPU camp in Zambia and unmade it, taking revenge on the guerrillas who had shot down Rhodesian civilian airliners with heat-seeking missiles earlier in the war. Heat-seeking missiles, mind you, provided by the USSR. By 1979, however, the Rhodesian security forces just couldn't keep up, and ZAPU, at least, was preparing to invade Rhodesia. Whites were starting to flee and the Rhodesian security forces were wearing thin. The end of the Bush War was in sight. Before any invasion could take place, Smith conceded to ending the white minority rule and establishing a multiracial democracy, and for much of the latter half of 1979, Rhodesia was renamed Zimbabwe Rhodesia. Smith did this with the assistance of a black Rhodesian-born bishop by the name of Abel Muzorewa, who soon replaced Smith as Prime Minister. ZAPU and ZANU, however, thought Muzorewa was little more than a puppet and they kept on fighting. At this point, Britain had had enough, organising a conference which came to be known as the Lancaster House Agreement. Under the agreement, it was decided that Rhodesia would fall temporarily under British rule until a fair election could be held. Under the watchful eye of a British Commonwealth force, the election went forward in 1980 and ZANU leader Robert Mugabe was voted into power. On the 18th of April, the British left and Rhodesia was declared independent and renamed Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, ZAPU wasn't too happy with the result of the election and violence between the two groups continued until 1987, after which they merged. All in all, some 20,000 civilians and 11,000 military personnel and guerrillas were killed in the Rhodesian Bush War. The Rhodesian Bush War is a story of atrocity, of sickening loss of life, and the violent transition of a former European colony through independence toward majority rule. With civilians on both sides murdered and brutalized, and with allegations of chemical warfare and domestic terrorism thrown back and forth across the divide, this is a grim period of African history, not to mention a confusing one. We know that Rhodesia, as a nation, no longer exists and is instead Zimbabwe. And so, we know which side came out on top in the struggle. For a while though, units of the Rhodesian army were scoring massive victories against their enemies, conducting operations that were breathtaking, both in their brutality and in their effectiveness. At least, that's what the Rhodesian media reported. So, let's get to the bottom of this. Just how effective were the Rhodesian security forces, the losing side of the Bush War, and how did such an efficient and ruthless fighting force fail in its long-term objectives? Conflict in Rhodesia began not so much with an explosion of violence as with a glimmer of hope. The hope that a peaceful, meaningful transition to multiracial governance could be achieved. The roots of the conflict stretch back to the early part of the 20th century when southern Rhodesia became a self-governing colony of the British Empire in 1923. But it wasn't until the 1950s that real change arrived on the horizon. First came the formation of the Central Africa Federation in 1953, bringing together southern and northern Rhodesia along with Nyasaland, or the modern countries of Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. Next was the reformation of the African National Congress in southern Rhodesia, often abbreviated as SRANC, in 1957. Under the leadership of Joseph Nkomo, the ANC was the first real African nationalist opposition to the local colonial authorities, and a body that was keen to play a big role in the future of this multiracial, multicultural union of British protectorates and colonies. The Central Africa Federation was pretty short-lived. The promise of a fruitful union just wasn't enough to stop the growth of independent sentiment across the three states, and the experiment lasted only a little over a decade. This incarnation of the ANC wasn't built to last either, and survived only 2 years before it was broken up by the colonial authorities in 1959 and its leaders arrested. Not Nkomo though, as he was out of the country then. By January 1960, Nkomo was back. He founded the National Democratic Party with the view of providing an African voice to the shifting political landscape of the new decade. He would shortly be joined by the two influential leaders Robert Mugabe and Ndabaningi Sithole. And then came the hope, the briefest flame of democratic promise and of change without violence or conflict. Nkomo and the NDP attended the Southern Rhodesian Constitutional Conference held in January 1961. Excluded from political debate and action for so long, African nationalists found themselves on the brink of legitimization and agency. At the conference, 15 seats were effectively promised to Africans out of a legislature of 65. This was still a minority, despite the fact that black Africans massively outnumbered white Rhodesians, but it was progress nonetheless. Nkomo and the NDP delegation, so the official report tells us, accepted these proposals. And then, they didn't. Under pressure from his fellow NDP members, Nkomo reversed his decision. The NDP would not accept the proposals, and instead, it would push for more representation and self-determinations for Africans in the region. But the 1961 conference had been a take-it-or-leave-it event, and the NDP found themselves isolated completely from the political system in southern Rhodesia. But things were about to get even worse for the NDP. In December 1961, they were outlawed. Nkomo escaped arrest once again, pulling the tried and tested move of being out of the country at the time. He would come back for a third bite at the political cherry, forming the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, which was once again banned in 1962, forcing Nkomo and his comrades into exile in Tanzania. By 1963, Sithole and Mugabe had had enough of Nkomo. Suspended by ZAPU, they formed their own party, the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, and a militant wing, the Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA. Nkomo's ZAPU would form its own militant group, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA. Rhodesia now had two enemy factions on its doorstep. While ZANU and ZAPU were struggling to gain a foothold in Zimbabwe, another political tug-of-war was going on. The 1962 general elections saw the United Federal Party decimated by the Rhodesian Front. Sick of Nkomo and his lack of action, ZANU and ZANLA decided on a bolder approach. In July of 1964, ZANLA forces killed an official from the Rhodesian Front. What had been a glimmer of hope only 3 years before was now a civil war. To fight a war, you need an army, and the Rhodesian Front had one. As the gravity of the empire faded and Rhodesia looked toward independence, it kept hold of the Rhodesian security forces that had been the colony's military arm for decades. These were battle-hardened troops who had served the British Empire in conflicts in Malaya and elsewhere. After fighting Chinese communists in Southeast Asia, these units were now up against Chinese-trained fighters here in southern Africa. This army might have been outnumbered, but they had experience on their side. They also had geopolitics on their side, at least in those early days of the war. To the south lay South Africa, a regime sympathetic to that of southern Rhodesia. To the east, Mozambique, then still part of the Portuguese Empire. As insurgent attacks broke out in the mid-1960s, they were really concentrated along only a single front, the border with northern Rhodesia, by now Zambia. This gave the Rhodesian security forces a huge advantage, but there were other factors too. The early attacks by ZANLA and ZIPRA militants were limited in scope. They focused on attacking white landowners in locations accessible from the Zambian border and on disrupting oil pipelines delivering resources to Mozambique. These militants also seemed disinterested in pursuing any kind of recruitment or hearts and minds angle of operations. There were few attempts to rally local support, and instead, there were small-scale attacks followed by small-scale attacks, followed by more small-scale attacks. The Rhodesian forces found it relatively easy to pick these militants off. The Battle of Sinoia is a prime example of how these early years of conflict went. Often described as the first major engagement of the Bush War, Sinoia was a pretty one-sided affair. In April 1966, Rhodesian forces intercepted a Zanla unit attempting to carry out insurgency activities in the north of the state. The Rhodesians engaged the insurgents, suffering no casualties and killing 7 Zanla fighters. The surviving Zanla troops disappeared back to the safety of the Zambian border. By the end of the decade, the Rhodesian forces were fully in control. Highly effective, incredibly well trained, and possessed of the kind of discipline and strategic resources the rebels just couldn't match, even with their communist training, the Rhodesians kept insurgency to a minimum. They completed routine patrols, engaged in sporadic firefights, and they kept Zanla pegged back. Zanla, aware that their efforts were not going well, sent fighters to the Soviet Union, to China, and to Cuba for training. The war was about to enter its second and altogether bloodier phase. In 1968, 4,500 miles away from Rhodesia, Portuguese dictator António Salazar suffered a massive stroke. Salazar, one of the last arch defenders of European colonies in Africa, would cling to life for 2 more years. Still, his ailing health spurred nationalist groups into action across Portugal's empire. By 1970, Salazar was dead, and by 1974, the empire was crumbling. Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith now had a problem. The newly independent Mozambique wasn't quite so sympathetic to his cause of minority rule. The Bush War had just opened up another front, and Smith called the state of emergency. Security units were now operating outside of Rhodesia. In 1976, the Silos Scouts units crossed into Mozambique, obliterating a rebel training camp and wiping out hundreds of trainees. In Zambia, the Zipra group loyal to Nkomo downed 2 civilian airliners, seeking out survivors and executing them in the jungle. The Rhodesians drove into Zambia in response, conducting a mixture of conventional and special forces raids and claiming hundreds of kills. It is amid this escalation of violence that the ruthless efficiency of the Rhodesian security forces really began to show. The Silos Scouts, who we've already mentioned, became one of the most fearsome units of the entire war, conducting brutal missions with formidable levels of success. A unit that included black soldiers, the Scouts were able to use deceit, subterfuge, and local knowledge to achieve their objectives, tricking enemy combatants into a false sense of security and then eliminating them in cold blood. Operation Eland, for example, in 1976, pitted either 72 to 84 Scouts, reports vary, against up to 1,200 guerrillas. After masquerading as a friendly force and gaining entry to the rebel camp, the Scouts opened fire. Only 5 Scouts were wounded, while almost all of the guerrillas were killed. It has been alleged that the Silos Scouts used other tactics to achieve victory in the field, with some claiming that biological and chemical warfare was deployed by the unit. Accusations of murder, arson, and sexual assault were also leveled against the Scouts. The Rhodesian Special Air Services, or SAS, and the Rhodesian Light Infantry, RLI, were 2 more of the aces in Smith's hand. Well-drilled, well-led, and capable of frightening efficacy in the field, these troops were the scourge of the guerrilla fighters, both within Rhodesia and beyond the Mozambique and Zambian borders. Operation Dingo, also known as the Chimoio Massacre in 1977, saw RLI paratroopers, supported by the aging aircraft of the Rhodesian Air Force, drop into enemy territory with a clear objective in mind. A formerly Portuguese-owned farm that intelligence suggested had become a massive insurgent camp. With the SAS alongside them, the RLI swept into the camp in a devastating operation that reportedly claimed the lives of 1,200 insurgents, with 2 Rhodesians killed. Zanla sources do not dispute these figures, but alleged that the casualty list included hundreds of innocent civilians gunned down by the SAS and RLI, something the Rhodesian security forces denied. The naming of the Rhodesian SAS was not a coincidence. Until independence, the Rhodesians had served as an integrated squadron of the elite British SAS fighting force, earning the respect of their comrades in British uniforms. These troops were battle-hardened and extremely skilled. They also maintained strict trigger discipline, conserving ammunition and maintaining their effectiveness in the field for far longer than the rebel forces could. On an engagement-by-engagement basis, there was no contest. The Rhodesian army was one of the most effective fighting forces the world has ever seen. What is the objective of a fighting force? What is the aim of military success? Well, to win a war, to emerge victorious. By 1977, Prime Minister Ian Smith understood he was facing a grave situation. The man who had been the architect of Rhodesian independence from the British Empire only 12 years before was now on the ropes, and the very existence of what he understood as Rhodesia was in doubt. Stepping up guerrilla attacks throughout the 1970s, black nationalist groups had begun to chip away at the resolve of white Rhodesians. Time and time again, the operations of these guerrillas failed. They were intercepted, engaged, and defeated by the highly effective units of the Rhodesian security forces. But a battlefield is not just a battlefield. To many, it is a livelihood, a place to work and live. And so, for many white farmers and landowners in Rhodesia, enough was enough. They began to leave. Already a minority, the white population of Rhodesia dwindled even further in the face of repeated guerrilla attacks and insurgencies. The morale boost of a Rhodesian army victory was one thing, but the threat of destruction and death was quite another, and so white Rhodesians began to flow out of the country faster than ever before. But there were other factors at play here. Rhodesia's white population had always been a relatively transient one. They lacked the roots that some of the African nationalists had, with generations upon generations of historical ties to the area. So when the choice came, stay or leave, it wasn't such a difficult one to make. The economy, too. Counterinsurgency operations, even successful ones, cost money, and a seemingly endless chain of successful operations require endless funds to back it up. By the late 70s, Rhodesia's public coffers were feeling the strain. So, in 1977, Ian Smith was at the negotiating table. Opposite him, Bishop Mozorewa, a moderate black leader and someone who was a little more acceptable to the regime and the remaining white population than rebel commanders like Mugabe. The result was inevitable, a transfer of power to the majority African rule, which began in 1977. Mozorewa would continue working with Smith, first as joint members of the Transitional Executive Council, and then installing Smith as minister without portfolio until the end of 1979. Even after Mugabe's ZANU-PF party was swept to power in a landslide election win in 1980, Smith continued to serve in parliament. He retired in 1987. A maelstrom of economic pressures, dwindling support, negotiations with moderate leaders, and ceasefire talks with militants in London brought the Rhodesian Bush War to an end. For all the Rhodesian security forces' successes, they were on the losing side. So how does this impact the idea of the Rhodesian army as a wickedly effective fighting force? Our first instinct might be to say, not at all. Just look at the operational history. Engagement after engagement won, countless guerrilla fighters killed, minimal casualties, or even no casualties at all in many cases, for the security forces. These are textbook examples of how to win in the field. The Rhodesian army held up its part of the bargain, and it was political and economic factors that led to the collapse of Rhodesia. But is this really the case? Everything we've seen up to now paints the Rhodesians as well-drilled soldiers chalking up victory after victory in the field. But what about those longer-term goals, the political and strategic moves that are required to truly win a war? Weighing up the dual narratives of the Rhodesian security forces during the Bush War, historian Danny Bagg raises some interesting points. Answering a question on Quora, Bagg discussed the perception of the Bush War among white Rhodesians and the sort of language used to describe it. Gangsters. That's how the insurgents were often described. communist gangsters carry out acts of crime against civilian-owned farms and infrastructure, typically white civilian-owned. This was a crime wave, surely not a war, and when rebels were arrested, brought into police custody, tried in civilian courts, well, this just solidified the idea that Rhodesia was battling criminal thugs rather than political organizations with very real ideological and cultural objectives. The war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on terror. These ideas of a military campaign against a criminal element have become part of our global understanding. But not so much in the 60s and 70s. Back then, to use the language of crime to describe the landscape of war simply meant there was no war at all. There was just a bunch of bad guys seeking to create mayhem. So when white Rhodesians opened up newspapers or turned on TV sets and were met with the statistics of an operation, 20 or 30 enemies killed, weapons seized, no Rhodesian casualties, they must have thought victory was assured. The white minority was placated, the Rhodesian forces carried on their operations, and the political factors underlying were ignored. By the time the Rhodesian government realized its mistake, it was too late. The transition to a biracial government and the introduction of universal suffrage might have eased some of the political strife that fractured the nation had these moves been made years before. Still, by 1978, 15 years of conflict had taken its toll and there was no way back. The entire struggle might have been avoided if the NDP had not rejected the constitutional reforms of 1961, or if the Rhodesian Front had not excluded the NDP from subsequent negotiations. But this is just conjecture. But these are still political factors. We're still looking at the media presentation of the war and at the failure of the government to address the root causes of the problem. What could the Rhodesian military themselves have done differently? Perhaps the perception of the war wasn't only being manipulated by the government and state media. It could be that army commanders were also getting it wrong. While Rhodesian units were counting kills and reporting victories, the strategic balance was tipping the other way. By the mid-1970s, Zanla and Zipra guerrillas were gaining significant support across the country, bringing more and more of the black African majority over to their side. While they'd failed to win the hearts and minds of African Rhodesians in the 1960s, the 1970s were very, very different indeed. Huge swaths of Rhodesia became no-go areas for white minority settlers as guerrilla units expanded their influence across the region. While coming out on top in a firefight was the speciality of the Rhodesian forces, African nationalists acted with more guile and tactical nous, achieving the kind of broad support that would eventually bring them victory. There are subjective opinions and there are objective facts. It's so important to stick to the latter as we examine the Rhodesian army. So what are these facts? It's a fact that the Rhodesian army was incredibly effective in the field. Fighting countless engagements across a war that lasted well over a decade, the Rhodesians did not lose a single one. Reports of actual casualty ratios vary, but most suggest that it was seriously lopsided. For every single Rhodesian life that rebel groups took, they paid dearly with dozens of their own. It's a fact that Rhodesian army units were among the best trained and most ruthless in the world. The Rhodesian SAS had not simply been trained with the British SAS, they had been part of the SAS. They'd seen action and learned all about what it means to tackle a guerrilla force. The Sealer Scouts, on the other hand, took the guerrilla action back to the rebels, utilizing deceitful and guileful tactics to carry out devastating operations. But it's also a fact that Rhodesia is no more. The nation became Zimbabwe Rhodesia after the transition to majority rule, and then simply Zimbabwe after Mugabe's ZANU-PF election victory in 1980. The Rhodesian army, through a mixture of strategic short-sightedness and external political and economic factors, was on the losing side of the Bush War. It's easy to lay this blame squarely on the government, but the tactical decisions of the armed forces also have a case to answer. While the Rhodesian army celebrated the latest operational victory, it was losing control of large swaths of territory. When they finally noticed, it was too late. The end of any war doesn't necessarily mean the end of all tension between belligerents. Not long after World War II wrapped up, tensions between the East and West erupted into the 45-year-long Cold War, with heavy hitters such as the USSR and the United States threatening nuclear cataclysm on a global scale. On a smaller scale, the ripples of one particularly brutal Cold War-era conflict are still felt strongly to this day. We're of course talking about the Korean War and the border incidents that followed. In this video, we're going to discuss 8 of the bloodier ones. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea. From then until 1945, when Imperial Japan surrendered to the Allies in the Second World War, Korea was under Japanese rule. With the Japanese nuked and thoroughly defeated, the USSR and US divided Korea into 2 occupation zones. The nation split along the 38th parallel into the north and south. The Soviets administered the north, the Americans the south. In 1948, with things heating up between the USSR and US, Korea's administered regions became sovereign states. The north was ruled by Kim Il-sung's communists, and the south became the anti-communist Republic of Korea. Both governments thought they were the rightful rulers of the whole Korean peninsula. Meanwhile, North Korea had been providing military assistance to the Chinese Communist Party in the 1945 to 1949 phase of the Chinese Civil War, earning themselves a place in the soon-to-be created People's Republic of China, or PRC's good books. In June 1950, North Korea's Korean People's Army, or KPA, crossed the border into South Korea and, assured the support of the PRC and USSR, went to war with the South Korean army. In response, the United Nations, most notably the United States, got involved, and this led to a 3-year conflict in which as many as 1 million soldiers and 3 million civilians lost their lives. To cut a long story even shorter, the conflict came largely to an end on the 27th of July 1953, when the UN, KPA and Chinese People's Volunteer Army signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. As part of the armistice, North and South Korea established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, across the border. This is a buffer zone between the two states. It's about 250 kilometers or 160 miles long and 4 kilometers or 2.5 miles wide, and it's not impregnable. In fact, since the DMZ's establishment more than 70 years ago, both North Koreans and South Koreans have made incursions into the DMZ and their rival states. While some border incidents occurred back in the 50s and early 60s, one of the bloodiest early incidents began in October 1966 and went through to December of '69. Some consider it a second Korean War, but this incident is better known as the Korean DMZ Conflict. In 1966, with US forces and some South Korean divisions tied up in the Vietnam War, Kim Il-sung believed South Korea was in a more vulnerable position. He deployed some 386,000 troops along the DMZ. By this point, a man named Park Chung-hee was the president of South Korea. In answer, he sent out some 585,000 troops backed by a US Army, a US Corps, and 2 US divisions, a combined force that smeared itself across the edge of the DMZ. The North did not opt for a full-blown invasion, however. Instead, Kim Il-sung sent small units of lightly armed soldiers trained in guerrilla warfare to infiltrate South Korea and upset the South Korean defense. Lacking dedicated anti-guerrilla units, thousands of Kim Il-sung's infiltrators slipped through the South Korean lines, clashing with soldiers and civilians alike. Fighting also took place within the DMZ when opposing units ran into each other during patrols. At night on the 17th of June 1968, the North Korean Spec Ops Unit, Unit 124, penetrated the DMZ to assassinate President Park in the Blue House in Seoul, an incident known as the Blue House Raid. On the night of the 21st, posing as a South Korean patrol, the operatives made it to a checkpoint just 100 meters or 330 feet from the Blue House. Luckily for Park, a police unit stopped and questioned the operatives. When they were unable to give the police the answers they wanted, a police officer drew his pistol and Unit 124 opened fire. As they fled the checkpoint and back across the border, 29 of Unit 124's 31 operatives were shot dead. 1 escaped and 1 was captured. While Unit 124 managed to kill 30 South Koreans and Americans and wound a further 66 as they went, they absolutely failed their mission objective. After the failed Blue House raid, the South tightened its defenses, so Kim Il-sung looked to the coastline instead. On the 30th of October 1968, North Korea landed 120 Unit 124 operatives in South Korea's Gyeongsang and Gangwon provinces, intending to set up guerrilla bases in the Taebaek Mountains and indoctrinate the locals. The landing went well enough, but when they reached the mountains, they found out that the South Korean villagers had already been taught to guard themselves against communist infiltrators. The locals informed the authorities, and some 70,000 South Korean troops went out on a manhunt through to late December, killing or capturing all but 3 of the 120 men. In the final year of the Korean DMZ conflict, a pair of North Korean MiG-21s shot down an American Lockheed EC-121M Warning Star over the Sea of Japan, killing 31 men. But there weren't any other major infiltrations. Throughout that year, the North's efforts tapered and the South claimed victory. 7 years later, in August 1976, 5 workers of the Korean Service Corps, or KSC, accompanied by 2 US Army officers, a South Korean captain, and 11 United Nations personnel, entered the DMZ's Joint Security Area to fell an obscuring poplar tree near the so-called Bridge of No Return. Not long after they began, some 15 North Korean soldiers arrived and told them to stop cutting the tree. The American captain, Arthur Boniface, ignored the North Koreans, telling his boys to keep on cutting. Then, a further 20 North Koreans arrived in a truck carrying crowbars and clubs. At this point, the KSC workers dropped their axes and gave it legs. The North Koreans seized the weapons and turned them on the US officers, hacking and bludgeoning Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett. Boniface was killed on the spot, and they fatally wounded Barrett, who died on the way to the hospital. Later, the North Koreans claimed they had acted out of self-defense. The US Army, the UN Joint Security Force, and the South Koreans retaliated by means of Operation Paul Bunyan, driving to the Joint Security Area with chainsaws to end the poplar tree for good. While the Americans and South Koreans deployed a great many troops and military assets, including attack helicopters, fighter jets, and bombers, to oversee the operation, things did not escalate beyond a good old-fashioned demeasuring. Now, let's jump ahead 20 years to 1996, 2 years after Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack. On the 16th of September, a North Korean Sang-O-class submarine ran aground trying to deposit a recon team on the South Korean coast near the town of Jeongdongjin. With the sub out of action, 23 North Koreans tried to sneak their way overland to the DMZ. The South Koreans soon caught wind of them, deploying some 43,000 soldiers to hunt the enemy operatives down. They ultimately killed 13 of the operatives, found the corpses of 11 executed by their own men, and captured 1. The final operative was listed as missing. The captured man was taken in for interrogation. He revealed everything and later defected to the south. Less than 3 years later, something went down in the West Sea. In June 1999, the North Koreans, now led by Supreme Leader Kim Jong-il, decided to redraw the maritime boundary between the North and the South, known as the Northern Limits Line, or NLL. A few days after the North Koreans started testing the NLL on the 9th of June, crossing the line near Yongpyong Island, the South Korean Navy retaliated by physically bumping into the North Korean vessels, instead of being the ones to fire the first shot. On the 15th, around 20 North Korean fishing boats, 4 patrol boats, and at least 1 torpedo boat were south of the NLL, ramming the South Korean vessels as the South Koreans had previously done to them. At around 9:30 am, a North Korean patrol boat got sandwiched between 2 enemy boats and decided to respond by firing on them with machine guns and a 25mm cannon. The South Koreans answered in kind, and a skirmish broke out, with the South Koreans sinking 1 torpedo boat, damaging 5 patrol boats, killing as many as 30 men, and wounding a further 70. By 11 am, the North Koreans had limped back over the NLL. In 2002, the Koreans clashed once again in a second battle of Yeonpyeong, though the bombardment of Yeonpyeong in 2010 was far more significant. On the 23rd of November, some 70,000 South Korean and US troops were performing their annual Hoguk exercise, which was essentially a giant military drill that took place on Yeonpyeong Island and Bangyong Island south of the NLL. They used live rounds during the drill, but stated they were aiming their fire to the south. The North Koreans thought otherwise, believing it was some sort of attack. At around 2:30 p.m, batteries on the islands of Mudo and Kemori started shelling Yeonpyeong, firing 2 barrages in total. The guns at Yeonpyeong answered, After about an hour, the North stopped firing and the South followed suit an hour after that. All in all, just 2 South Korean civilians and 2 soldiers were killed, while a further 22 were wounded. The attack started fires all throughout the island, however, destroying 70% of its forests and fields and around 30 buildings. The North's Korean Central News Agency later claimed that the South had used the civilians present on the island as a human shield to cover military action. The African continent was an absolute hotbed of fighting during the Cold War. As the old colonial empires of Europe receded, 2 new empires reached out across the globe to take their place, championing new world orders based on either crony capitalism or militant communism. One place this conflict infected was Southwest Africa, now Namibia, where the South African Defence Force fought a 23-year-long war that, in the minds of many, has been forgotten. In this video, we tell the story of the South African Border War and Namibia's struggle for independence. Like so many modern conflicts with colonial origins, the best place for us to start is the end of the First World War. Southwest Africa had been a German colony until 1915, when it was invaded by South Africa, which was then a British dominion. After the war, the region became a League of Nations mandate. However, as South Africa was a powerful and developed neighbour, they retained administrative control over the territory. When the UN superseded the League of Nations in 1945, they requested the South African government apply for a trusteeship over the territory. The South Africans one-upped them, asking to annex it instead. The UN was pretty much like, no, you can't do that, but South Africa did it anyway. By the late 1940s, Southwest Africa was effectively run as a South African province. But what did this actually mean? Apartheid. The South African government exported one of the world's most oppressive regimes, one that Nelson Mandela described as diabolical in its detail, inescapable in its reach, and overwhelming in its power, to their newly gained territory of Southwest Africa. This worked in favour of the few thousand German and Boer settlers, but seriously screwed over the other 90% of the territory's inhabitants, the indigenous Africans. Every aspect of their lives was regulated, scrutinised, and policed with extreme prejudice by their new overlords. The thing with systematic, institutionalised oppression on a national scale is people don't like it. As the 1950s wore on into the 1960s, Southwest African resistance groups started popping up across the territory. They staged demonstrations and boycotts, and the police usually responded with bullets. One of the main resistance groups was the Southwest African People's Organisation, or SWAPO. Their goal was to take back land and industry from the occupying South Africans and enact sweeping welfare, healthcare, and educational reforms. The US was on good terms with South Africa, so they did their bro a solid and declared SWAPO communist. When the real communists over in the USSR found out, they were more than happy to send military aid to Southwest Africa's border regions to prepare SWAPO for a grand revolutionary struggle. Realizing very quickly that a side had been picked for them, SWAPO fell in with the communists, although they didn't have much of a choice. With the aid of Soviet instructors, SWAPO developed a potent guerrilla force known as the Liberation Army, or SWALA. From September 1965, SWALA guerrillas began infiltrating Southwest Africa from secret bases in Zambia. By August 1966, the South African Defence Force were hot on their trail, tracking the insurgents to their base at Omogulogwambashe. The inexperienced insurgents were taken by surprise by an elite force of SADF paratroopers and police. For the South Africans, Operation Wildebeest, as it was known, was a minor counterinsurgency mission, but for SWAPO, it was the start of a long war for independence. The South African Border War, as it was known in Pretoria, had now begun. With increasing conflict on the border, the South Africans cracked down even harder on the Namibian population. This, in turn, fed more military recruits to SWALA, leading to more fighting, and the cycle continued. But even with their ranks swelling, and even with new armories from the Soviet Union, Swallow couldn't take on the SADF in a conventional battle, so they got asymmetric. After renaming themselves the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, the freedom fighters got to work planting landmines on SADF patrol routes. This tactic was super effective against the lightly armored paratroopers and police. PLAN also launched assaults on lightly defended regional police stations and installations. In January 1973, 50 insurgents armed with machine guns, rockets, and mortars obliterated an entire police base in the Caprivi, now Zambezi, region near Zambia. Despite being veterans of the Rhodesian Bush War, the police defenders were soundly defeated. When reports got back to Pretoria, the South Africans were furious. If the insurgents wanted a fight, the South African army was going to give it to them. Between 1973 and 1974, the SADF's budget increased by 150%. 15,000 troops rolled out along Southwest Africa's northern border, clearing and demarcating it as the cut line. SADF soldiers patrolled the cut line 24/7 looking for signs of infiltration from Angola, but Angola was having troubles of its own. In April 1974, Portugal's authoritarian dictatorship was deposed and its colonial holdings were set free. Three groups, UNITA, FNLA, and MPLA, rose to fill the power vacuum left in Angola. The MPLA was aligned with the Soviets and received huge amounts of weapons from them. This gave them the edge they needed to push UNITA and FNLA out of Angola's capital. In response, the CIA did what it does best and started funneling weapons to the FNLA. By 1975, things were seriously heating up. For the SADF, all communists looked the same, so they lumped the MPLA in the enemy pile with the PLAN. They then disguised 2,500 soldiers as mercenaries and sent them over the border to fight alongside UNITA, commanded by confirmed Giga Chad Jonas Savimbi. They had one goal.
Death to the MPLA!
But the MPLA had friends, and in November 1975, 12,000 Cuban soldiers showed up with heavy weapons and a full Soviet flotilla. This massive communist force crushed the CIA-backed FNLA and Savimbi's UNITA. The South Africans were forced to pull back to the border. The MPLA took Angola, and the Soviet-backed PLAN suddenly started getting a lot more help for their fight in Southwest Africa. SWAPO chief Sam Nuoma commented, "It was as if a locked door had suddenly swung open. We could at last make direct attacks across our frontier and send in forces and weapons on a large scale." PLAN guerrillas attacked the cut line regularly, but they were nearly always intercepted by small SADF patrols. The brunt of the fighting was done by these small sections, leading to this phase of the conflict becoming known as the Corporals' War. The SADF wanted to send large units over the Angolan border with armor and air support in an attempt to crush the PLAN, but the politicians were against it. The war had dragged on for over a decade now, and every time a South African body came home, it got less popular. The apartheid regime tried to sell the public on a war of communist containment, but many saw it as neo-colonial expansionism. It was getting expensive too, as South Africa had now become the primary check to communist forces backed up by the industrial might of the USSR and raw Cuban manpower. In 1978, after a spate of successful border raids by the PLAN, the SADF finally got the go-ahead to cross the border in force. As part of Operation Reindeer, 370 paratroopers of the 44th Parachute Brigade attacked the Angolan mining town of Kasinga. The soldiers had been told it was a PLAN administrative headquarters, but this is where history gets a little murky. SWAPO and the Cubans claimed that Kasinga wasn't an insurgent base, but a refugee camp that just happened to have some fighters passing through. A passing Swedish photographer noted that the camp had both facilities for refugees and a uniformed PLAN presence, insinuating that neither side was telling the whole truth. What resulted was a massacre. The SADF hit Kasinga with airstrikes, then the paratroops led a ground assault. Sources concur that they killed around 600 people. In return, the Paras only suffered 3 dead. Undoubtedly, the PLN soldiers would have put up a stout defense, but the fact that they only killed 3 soldiers suggests that most of those dead weren't PLN, as South Africa claimed, but rather civilians. The international community reached a similar conclusion, and old allies like the United States and Britain openly condemned South Africa. Global opposition to apartheid was growing, and even though they were fighting the commies, no one thought the SADF were the good guys anymore. From the 70s to the late 80s, the war dragged on with no end in sight. SADF troops made repeated incursions to Angola to hunt down PLN forces while trying to prevent those same forces doing the same to them. The Soviets refused to back down too and continued supplying top-tier weaponry to the insurgents. On the ground, the SADF were more than a match for the inexperienced insurgents, but they were spread too thinly to effectively press their advantage. There was even a short ceasefire from 1984 to 1985, but that fell apart after both sides broke the rules. The final and largest battle was fought intermittently between August 1987 and March 1988 around the city of Quito Cuanavale in Angola. The SADF had pushed deep into Angola and the MPLA and Cubans were pushing back. They launched a massive offensive with tanks, APCs, aircraft, and thousands of troops. In front of them stood 700 SADF soldiers, along with old mate Savimbi and over 50,000 of his boys. The communists were routed, but managed to regroup in the city. For 7 months, Savimbi's UNITA and the SADF were unable to break through the communist defenses, but the MPLA and Cubans couldn't push them back either. It was a stalemate. After back and forth fighting for nearly 2.5 decades, a stalemate was what everyone needed. It forced the major players to come to the negotiating table and sketch out a plan for peace. By 1989, the Cubans went home, the Soviets closed the armory, Angola was finally able to hold an election, which Savimbi tried to start another war over when he didn't win. The South Africans pulled back to their own border, and Namibia finally got independence. As apartheid disintegrated, Namibia was finally free to govern itself, and South Africa became far more interested in domestic affairs. The border war ended on March 21st, 1990, 23 years after it began. Angola, a land of stunning landscapes, a rich network of cultures and languages, and a wealth of natural resources. This should be one of the jewels in the crown of Southern Africa, a place of happiness, prosperity, and hope. And perhaps it will be. Perhaps the coming years, decades, centuries will be kind to this nation on Africa's southwest coast. After centuries of colonial exploitation and decades of brutal conflict, this nation and her people have undergone unimaginable hardships and suffering. They deserve their time of peace and dignity. Since the fracturing of European colonial systems in Africa in the middle of the last century, Angola has been a scene of almost unrelenting bloodshed. It's also a place where global superpowers pull strings, flick switches, and cast human life aside as they play games of ideological and geopolitical supremacy. The Angolan Civil War was a tragedy on an enormous scale, but it was also a focal point for Cold War posturing, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and millions more with no place to go. This is untangling Africa, and this is the Angolan Civil War, when ideologies and ethnicities collide and civilian communities are torn apart. A coastal nation of seafarers and explorers perched on the western extreme of Europe, Portugal got a head start on its neighbours in the race for imperial power. Reaching the Congo Kingdom in what is now Angola as early as 1483, the Portuguese set about creating a colonial base in southwest Africa, exploiting its resources, dealing in slaves, and spreading their own brand of Christianity among the local population. Nearly 4.5 centuries later, and the Portuguese monarchy was finished. The Republic of Portugal was declared in 1910, and in 1926, the military seized power in a bloodless coup, paving the way for the fascist dictatorship of Antonio Salazar from 1932 onwards. But even after such wholesale change, the Portuguese were still in Angola. In fact, Angola was being pulled closer into Lisbon's orbit. By 1951, Angola was no longer a colony, instead transitioning to a province of Portugal itself. Those who thought this might herald a new era of equality between indigenous Angolans and their European Portuguese counterparts would have had their hopes quickly dashed. Forced labour, rampant exploitation, and the dilution of Angolan language, culture, and belief by mass migration from Europe pushed the region to the brink. But Angola was not isolated anymore. Centuries of maritime trade connected the land to the outside world. Money and commodities flowed back and forth across her ports and docks, and ideas did too. Ideas like African nationalism and decolonisation. Ideas like Marxism and socialism. After 10 years of provincial status, the pressure cooker of Angola was ready to blow. Only 3 days into 1961, cotton plantation workers launched the Baixa de Cassandra Revolt, a protest over their miserable working conditions. Identity cards were openly burned and Portuguese traders were assaulted on the plantation. The following day, Portuguese planes shattered the revolt, bombing villages indiscriminately and killing up to 7,000 people in a sickening display of power. In February, the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA, formed only 5 years earlier, unsuccessfully attempted to spring some of its activists from an Angolan prison. In retaliation, settlers carried out their own raids on black Angolan neighborhoods, leaving countless dead in their wake. In March, another revolt broke out over forced plantation labor, and the colonial authorities hit back with more air raids in Baixa de Cassandra and in the Icalo-Ibengo region, while Portuguese ground forces moved in. Portuguese retaliation for the March revolt left some 20,000 natives dead. This might have caused outrage back home in Europe, but it didn't. As well as tens of thousands of African lives, the revolts had also claimed around 1,000 European lives. Some of these Europeans had been killed, often brutally and purposefully, some tortured and raped. It was this that caused the outrage back in Portugal. Public opinion was clear. The rebellion must be crushed. For more than a decade, bloody conflict ravaged Angola. The Union of Peoples of Angola, UPA, was one of the key belligerents, eventually merging with the Democratic Party of Angola, PDA, to form the National Liberation Front of Angola, FNLA. The MPLA also remained active, opening up a new front in the east of Angola. A third group, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, began their own campaigns in late 1966. As war spread across the country, it was often the local populations who suffered the most, as a diverse, complex, and centuries-old tribal network was shattered by the forces of modern ideology and weaponry. In 1968, the decades-long rule of Antonio Salazar was essentially at an end. A massive stroke put the dictator out of action, although he would live for another 2 years. The wheels of the Portuguese political machine were still turning though, and the fascist Estadio Novo limped on. The early 1970s brought new tactics from the colonial forces, reminiscent of those employed by the US in Vietnam, as napalm and defoliating agents sowed death and destruction in Angola, but still, they could not crush local resistance. In the end, it would be a domestic struggle that brought about the end of the empire. The Socialist Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974 shifted Portuguese politics from right to left. The following year, Angola declared independence. On November 11, 1975, the new nation of Angola was officially born. After 13 years of bloodshed, the Angolans had prevailed, freeing themselves from the yoke of Portuguese colonialism with a little help from political discord in Lisbon. But what is an Angolan? Are the Ovimbundu the true Angolans, the descendants of the Bantu tribes who settled the central coastal regions over the last 1,000 years? Or is it the Ambundu, another group tracing its lineage back to the Bantu, speaking the Kimbundu language and settling in the northwest? Or how about the Bakongo? The Bakongo and the Ambundu were once aligned until the latter won its independence way back in the 1550s. And what about other tribes, cultures, and communities that call this place home? More than 1/5 of modern Angolans are in this collective of different groups. The answer is all of the above. Angola is a richly diverse nation, a multitudinous landscape of cultures, languages, and identities. The Portuguese never had to bother themselves too much with this. They dealt with the prevailing forces in the region and used military might and economic power to subjugate the land until they could not do so anymore. But in a newly independent, post-colonial African nation, it was different. If Angola was going to have a new voice for a new age, all would need to be represented. But the new Angola had a new kind of diversity too. Political and ideological disagreement had been a common theme throughout the War of Independence, as the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA vied to be the dominant force in Angolan nationalism. Now, without a common enemy, their attentions began to turn toward one another. The MPLA was a Marxist socialist organization initially linked to the Mbundu people in the northwest. The internationalist outlook of the communist movement meant the MPLA had some powerful friends, particularly the Soviet Union and Cuba, as well as East Germany and Yugoslavia. The Cubans even sent their own military personnel to fight alongside their Angolan allies. The FNLA adopted more of an African nationalist approach, initially devoting itself to the Bakongo and gaining the support of Mobutu Sese Seko in neighbouring Zaire in the process. With the Cold War in full swing, any enemy of communism was a de facto friend of the West, and the United States lent their support to the FNLA once fellow NATO member Portugal was out of the picture. UNITA, with its main base of support among the Omvambundu, was left-leaning like the MPLA and nationalist like the FNLA, but could find little common ground with either. Following the Sino-Soviet split at the end of the 1950s, the People's Republic of China was keen to fight a Cold War of its own, backing UNITA in opposition to the Russians. This led to the adoption of Maoist principles within the group during the ensuing Civil War. South Africa also supported UNITA with their own military units. The War of Independence had liberated the country of Angola, but it had broken it too. Tens of thousands of Angolans, many of them civilians, lay dead after only 12 months of fighting. By the time the Carnation Revolution rolled around, the death toll ran into the hundreds of thousands. But the leaders of a factionalized Angola were not finished with the bloodshed just yet. It was the MPLA that struck first, seizing control of the capital at Luanda in the wake of the Portuguese withdrawal. They declared independence and installed a new Angolan leader, President Agostinho Neto. The FNLA was not going to stand by and let this happen, and they launched an assault on the MPLA's Luanda base, their confidence buoyed by the fact that Mobutu and Zaire had backed their horse. It would not be enough. With Soviet support, thousands of Cuban troops, and Yugoslav warships, the MPLA defeated the FNLA, potentially knocking one of the three key powers out of the conflict. But the FNLA was not quite done. UNITA were far weaker militarily than the MPLA, but they had the greatest popular support. In an effort to save their own skin and keep themselves in the fight, the FNLA's leaders established a second capital with UNITA at Huambo, and sent out pleas to South Africa to help them overcome Soviet and MPLA control in the region. South Africa heeded the call, but by the mid-1970s, the country's apartheid regime was isolated on the international stage, and what assistance they could provide would be limited. The MPLA understood this, and they seized their chance. As international units and advisors drained out of the country, only the Cubans and the South Africans remained. Soon, it would only be the Cubans, as they made the weight of numbers and the power of the Comintern tell in their operations against isolated South African troops. By 1977, the MPLA had achieved almost complete control, establishing a Marxist-Leninist government and stacking another piece upon the teetering seesaw of international Cold War politics. Not all members of the MPLA welcomed the party's new political identity. Nito Alves, a high-ranking party member with huge support, demanded Neto align Angola more closely with the Soviets. Neto, accusing his opponent of destabilizing party unity, held a vote. Alves and his supporters, known as Nitistas, were dismissed. On the night of May 27, 1977, soldiers loyal to Alves launched an audacious raid on Sao Paulo prison, freeing 150 Natista prisoners. Next, they took control of the radio station, announcing the coup that was taking place to the people of Angola. From here, they swept through Luanda, kidnapping generals and officials and commandeering the presidential palace, although Neto was not there. but the government's forces had already begun their counteroffensive. As it dawned on them that the coup was about to fail, the Natistas took their fury out on their prisoners, murdering 6 government and military officials before Cuban units restored government control. In the weeks that followed, the MPLA exacted bloody revenge on supporters of Alves, or simply those they suspected of being supporters. Around 2,000 of the suspected Natistas were murdered during this act of retribution. At some time during this carnage, somewhere, no one is quite sure, Nito Alves himself was captured and killed. His coup attempt was unsuccessful, and he paid the ultimate price. Neto died in 1979, and Jose Eduardo dos Santos took over as president of Angola. After 2 years of Marxist-Leninist rule, the country's economy was struggling, kept alive primarily by its oil production and its international support from nations within Moscow's sphere of influence. While MPLA solidified its power, the FNLA was fading away. The UNITA, on the other hand, was growing stronger, becoming the main opponent of Dos Santos's Luanda-based government. South Africa, perhaps still smarting from their defeats in the 70s, or maybe just worried about the prospect of a Soviet bloc power in southwestern Africa, got back on the offensive in a big way, supporting their allies in the UNITA. The South African Defence Force raided Cunene province in the south of Angola on May 12, 1980, and then again in Cuando-Cubango province on May 21st. The MPLA was enraged, levelling accusations of atrocities against UNITA and South Africa and threatening a robust response. South Africa was unmoved, and on June 7th, they made an astonishing move. Attacking through Namibia, South African forces launched a double-pronged assault, knocking out the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO command center in the north of the country, and then carrying on with the full-scale invasion of Cunene and Cuando-Cubango. UNITA, along with South Africa, now had real swaths of territory in the south of Angola. The international community was outraged, but few nations took any meaningful action. The exceptions were Cuba, who sent yet more troops across the Atlantic to Angola, bolstering their ranks to 40,000 by 1985, and Zaire, who reinforced their support for the MPLA. On the international stage, outrage does not last long. By 1985, the USA, displeased by the ongoing existence of a Marxist-Leninist state in Africa's southwest, stepped up things a gear, providing military aid to UNITA for the first time. Meanwhile, the MPLA had rebranded, becoming the MPLA-PT, the Partido Trabalhista or Labour Party, and by 1987 they were back on the offensive. A war that was now 12 years old was about to step up in intensity once again. 2 years on, and the two invaded provinces were still in rebel hands. The MPLA now had their own formal armed forces, the FAPLA, and retaking these provinces had become top priority. So far, they'd had no luck. Throughout 1986, attempts were made to push the South Africans out of the country and to wipe out UNITA forces at Cuando-Cubango and Cunene. Now in August 1987, the FAPLA was preparing to throw everything at their enemies and bring Cuando-Cubango back under MPLA control for good. 8 brigades would advance on 2 fronts, pushing the rebels back to Mavinga, while driving insurgents out of Moxico province to the east. If all went to plan, the next objective would be Jumba and the UNITA headquarters. But all did not go to plan, and what followed would be the biggest battle on African soil since El Alamein. For UNITA, the objective was survival. For the South Africans, it was to assist their UNITA allies and prevent the SWAPO from gaining a foothold in the south of Angola. For both, losing valuable ground to the FAPLA was unthinkable. As the FAPLA troops advanced in the town of Ciuté Cuanavale, a key objective on the way to Mavinga, the South African Defence Forces came out to stop them. The SADF units hit FAPLA hard. They'd been humiliated the previous decade, but that wasn't going to happen again. This time, it was the government forces and their Cuban allies who would turn tail and run, leaving thousands of their comrades dead on the battlefield behind them. Skirmishes around the area continued into 1988, and both sides claimed some form of victory. Ultimately, it was UNITA and South Africa who won the day, achieving their own objectives while the MPLA missed out on most of theirs. What was supposed to be an ultimate assault on rebel positions in the south had failed, and the rebels had earned themselves a seat at the negotiating table. In 1988, delegations from Cuba, from the MPLA, and from South Africa met in New York to agree on a deal. Watching South Africa and Cuba at the table, US Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Chester Croker reportedly said, was like watching two scorpions in a bottle. Despite the obvious animosity, both the Cubans and the South Africans were eager to achieve a mutually acceptable climb down from conflict. Cuba had lost a huge number of its soldiers in Angola, while South Africa was alarmed by the rising stakes of the situation. The accords were signed on December 22nd, and Cuba withdrew its forces the following January. South Africa had already withdrawn from Angola and would withdraw too from Namibia under the terms of the agreement. Namibia would gain total independence from South Africa the following year. By June of 1989, Dos Santos and his UNITA counterpart, Jonas Savimbi, would themselves get around the table and attempt to thresh out a ceasefire deal. An agreement was reached, but quickly fell apart. The war might have lost its international aspects, but the civil conflict was still far from over. Africa has been a hotbed of conflict for the last century. As the colonial regimes of the Old World withered, the shadow of the Cold War enveloped the continent. Vast natural resources were discovered and weapons proliferated, providing the means for idealists and renegades to take power for themselves. This is Untangling Africa, and in this episode, we're examining the Nigerian Civil War, otherwise known as the Biafra War. Nigeria gained independence from Britain in 1960, but this statement isn't entirely accurate. What's closer to the truth is, in 1960, Nigeria was created. Nigeria's borders were set by the Anglo-French Convention of 1898, also called the Niger Convention, and were essentially a line in the sand between the British and French empires in Africa. The border existed to divvy up resources on the Niger River, nothing more. When the Nigerian state was established in 1960, it inherited those colonial borders. That meant inside Nigeria, there were over 100 separate ethnic groups, of which several also owned land across the border in Benin, Niger, and Cameroon. Imagine if you drew a 1,000 kilometer square over Europe and declared it a country. How would you govern this state? Where would the capital be? What language would you speak? This was essentially the dilemma facing Nigeria in 1960, but for them, it was far more complex. When the Brits initially claimed Nigeria, they backed up their threats with military force. But this wasn't permanent. It wasn't feasible to maintain a large garrison forever, so the colonial officials used money. They bought off key locals and had them maintain order instead. In Nigeria's north, which had traditionally been discovered by a strictly conservative Muslim hierarchy, this was easy. The dominant local group, the Hausa, were used to not having a say, and their lives changed little. In Nigeria's south, where the Igbos and Yoruba resided, things were different. Governance had traditionally been village-based and was akin to local councils. Anyone who wanted to could participate in this form of government, and consequently, the Brits found these areas much harder to control. Harder to control meant that the Brits established a stronger presence there, checking up on things, making arrests, and managing their interests. With them came Christian missionaries who converted much of the population. Before long, wealthy Igbo families were sending their sons to schools and universities in Britain. They were Christian, had plenty of money, and spoke good English, meaning they fit right in to Britain, and many pursued top-level academic qualifications before returning to Nigeria. This wasn't the case for the Hausa in the north, who remained largely shielded from British influence. In the 1940s and early 50s, political parties formed from the highly educated and politically conscious Yoruba and Igbo peoples. In Nigeria's southwest, the Yoruba formed the Action Group in the west, or simply the AG, and in the southeast, the dominant Igbo formed the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, or the NCNC. The Hausa jumped on the bandwagon too, forming the Northern People's Congress, or NPC, to control the northern parts of the country. Despite some of their similarities, a split existed between the AG and NCNC, particularly over Nigeria's capital. Lagos, the parliamentary seat, was a Yoruba town, and the AG didn't want to lose sovereignty over it if it became the country's official capital. The AG also wanted to enshrine a right of secession into the post-colonial constitution. The Igbo NCNC was firmly against this and pursued a platform of national unity at all costs. British colonial officials had stacked the parliament, so the less radical Hausa NPC always had the final say in issues such as these. In this case, they sided with the NCNC, and Nigeria's 1946 constitution did not allow secession. It also granted the Crown, which essentially meant BP Shell, exclusive rights over any oil found in the country. This would have deadly ramifications. Nigeria gained independence on October 1st, 1960, and exactly 3 years later became a republic. 1964 was an election year and tensions mounted. Workers' strikes around Lagos highlighted the inequality between ordinary people and politicians. The army was called upon to put the strikes down, and they did so with brutal efficiency. But the soldiers were ordinary people and began to resent the politicians whose orders they followed. Fraud was rampant in the election, and the Hausa NPC won a comfortable majority. They were happy to work with British companies, and soon nearly half of Nigeria's export economy was run by BP Shell. The vast majority of this was from oil fields in the country's south, where the Igbo lived, and not in the north, where the Hausa leaders came from. For the Igbo, it felt like they'd just swapped one colonial regime for another. They had to take action. In 1966, Igbo military officers launched a coup. They executed many of Nigeria's Hausa and Yoruba elites in the capital, but were not strong enough to seize power for themselves. The Igbo head of the Nigerian army, Johnson Agoye Aronsi, filled the vacuum. He seemed willing to work toward unification, but fatally failed to prosecute the Igbo coup plotters. In October, dissatisfied Hausa soldiers launched a counter-coup and killed him. This wasn't the end of the violence, far from it. In the north, soldiers massacred Igbos in the streets. American anthropologist Charles Kyle was in northern Nigeria at the time. He later recalled, "The intent of the soldiers, the only power that counts in Nigeria now or then, was painfully clear. After counting the disemboweled bodies along the Makurdi Road, I was escorted back to the city by soldiers who apologized for the stench and explained politely that they were doing the world a great favor by eliminating Igbos." To further punish the Igbos, the Hausa-controlled parliament split Nigeria into 11 states, deliberately cutting Igbos off from their oil fields in the process. With no legal path to secession, the Igbo-dominated southern region of Nigeria broke away, becoming the Republic of Biafra in May 1967. Nigeria blockaded Biafra immediately, declaring to the world that they were preventing Igbo forces from receiving arms shipments. While this hamstrung the fledgling Biafra army, the blockade's primary impact was a restriction of food and medical supplies. People in Biafra began to starve, and children suffered the worst. Nigerian statesman Obafemi Awolowo later said, "All is fair in war, and starvation is one of the weapons of war." It was a humanitarian crisis, a fully intentional one. Oil tankers were initially allowed through the blockade, but this ended when Nigeria discovered that BP Shell had paid taxes to the Biafran government, which contravened Nigerian law. The Six-Day War also broke out a week after the blockade began, and Middle Eastern oil wasn't passing through the Suez Canal. Global oil prices rose sharply. This was when everything changed. Genocides, pogroms, and widespread starvation are one thing, but messing with the world's, and more specifically Britain's oil supply is something else entirely. The world took sides. In return for a guarantee that BP Shell's infrastructure would remain private, Britain backed Nigeria. British intelligence officers began working for the Nigerian army and put the Nigerians in touch with arms dealers around the world. Despite the British PM declaring otherwise, the British gave the Nigerians 2 naval vessels and at least 60 armoured vehicles. BP Shell were also happy to pay oil-field royalties early so the Nigerian government had spare cash to spend on more British arms. On the flip side, London-based charities Oxfam and Save the Children were flying food supplies into Biafra to aid the starving population, working against the British government. Many other countries took a humanitarian stance and sent food supplies to Biafra. Among them were the Vatican, Canada, Sweden, Germany, and the US. As capitulation through starvation was Nigeria's goal, relief flights were targeted by Nigerian fighters. In June 1969, an International Red Cross DC-7 donated by Sweden was shot down while delivering aid. Before the war, Nigeria had no substantial air force, and both Britain and the US refused to sell them fighter aircraft. So how did the Nigerians shoot down the Red Cross plane? In the summer of 1967, the Soviet Union sold Nigeria 17 MiG-17s and provided them with 200 technicians. This was part of a broader mission to establish trade relations between Nigeria and the USSR. It worked, and Nigeria began purchasing more Soviet hardware. Training, however, was a different story. The inexperienced Nigerian air crews couldn't handle their new jets, so they subcontracted the Egyptian Air Force to fly them. To summarize, Egyptian pilots flying Soviet jets for Nigeria shot down an American-made International Red Cross plane donated by Sweden and delivering aid to Biafra. On the ground, things were just as confusing. French planners were keen to limit British influence in sub-Saharan Africa and were jealous of Britain's domination of oil resources around the Niger River. They championed the Biafran cause internationally, but refused to officially recognize the young country. Just like Britain, the French wanted to supply weapons, but they also wanted deniability. Luckily, they had the perfect solution. Thousands of World War II era German and Italian firearms were still sitting in French warehouses in the 1960s. By obliterating the serial numbers, these weapons couldn't be traced back to France. The Biafran Historical Research Center was set up in Paris as a front to smuggle weapons to Biafra via nearby Gabon and Côte d'Ivoire. The Portuguese joined in too, smuggling weapons through French channels to Biafra to combat growing British influence in the region. Wanting in on the action, communist Czechoslovakia began selling weapons to the French, who imported them into Biafra too. But the Czechs stopped once the Soviets found out and decided the Eastern Bloc was supporting Nigeria. Like the communists, the Israelis supported both sides. They initially sold heavy weapons to Nigeria, but switched allegiance after people began likening the wholesale starvation of Biafran children to the Holocaust. Mossad funneled arms and cash to Biafra through clandestine routes similar to the French. But not all the world's communists were on the same page. China declared its support for Biafra, fighting against Anglo-American imperialism and Soviet revisionism by supplying over $2 million in weapons via Tanzania. Mercenaries were heavily involved too. They came from many places, drawn to Biafra by the promise of money and a good fight. They were funded directly by the Biafran government and, by extension, Biafra's international supporters. Despite a large presence in foreign media coverage of the conflict, Biafran leaders later argued the mercenaries did not help. It would have made no difference if not a single one of them came to work for the secessionist forces. In a way, the war was taken out of both Nigeria and Biafra's hands. Each side was reliant on foreign aid, and both promised foreign access to their rich oil fields to win over allies. With big players like Britain, the Soviet Union, and France at the table, whichever side acquired the most aid had a decisive advantage. In 1968, this was Nigeria. In June, Biafra was surrounded by Nigerian forces. Both sides continued to launch offensives throughout the war, but Biafran military was increasingly impacted by the growing humanitarian crisis. In December 1969, the Nigerians launched a major offensive that successfully split Biafra in two. A month later, the key Biafran population centers fell to further Nigerian attacks. The war officially ended on January 15, 1970. It lasted 2.5 years and cost between 45,000 and 100,000 soldiers their lives. Estimates vary, but it's likely that upwards of 2 million civilians were indirectly killed via starvation during the conflict. A similar number were displaced. The Igbo people still have not fully recovered, and many continue to face the lifelong consequences of acute childhood malnutrition. The old tensions remain deeply entrenched in modern-day Nigeria. In 2012, the separatist organization Indigenous People of Biafra was founded, and they continue to agitate for Biafran independence today. The Horn of Africa. a crossroads of the world where Arab and African traders came together in bustling economic hubs like Mogadishu and Hobyo. A shining example of cultural and ethnic diversity, home to the Amhara, Oromo, and Somali ethnic groups, among others. A treasure trove of natural and cultural significance, from the Lamadaya waterfalls and the Laskil prehistoric cave paintings of Somalia to the rock-hewn churches unique to Ethiopia. This is a special place, but it's also a tragic one. The scene of one of the last phases of colonial expansion in Africa, much of the region was invaded by Italy in 1935, and then partitioned between British and Italian control in the years following World War II. As the shackles of colonialism began to fall away, the transition to independence was a rough one, and the stage was set for a bloody conflict that would reverberate around the world. In this episode of Untangling Africa, we're examining the Ogaden War, a regional conflict that would capture global attention and leave this corner of the African continent reeling. In 1960, the Somali Republic declared independence, uniting lands previously controlled by the British and Italian empires. The new nation would last for only 9 years before it fell once again into tumult, this time in the form of a left-wing coup d'etat led by General Siad Barre in 1969. The coup was a significant event on the global stage as it followed the Yemeni corrective move, a step toward the formation of a socialist state in South Yemen, only 3 months earlier. Communism was now the mode of government on both sides of the Gulf of Aden, and the world was beginning to pay serious attention to the goings-on in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The USA, embroiled in a disastrous conflict of their own in Vietnam, would have been dismayed to see Africa as well as Asia falling under the sway of their sworn enemy, communist ideology. They would have been even more dismayed when, 5 years later, the Derg, or Provisional Military Administrative Council, overthrew the government of Emperor Haile Selassie and proclaimed a new regime of socialism in Ethiopia. Leftist thought and politics were gathering strength in East Africa. Those who thought the spread of communism would be contained to the Horn of Africa had not reckoned with the fall of Portugal's African Empire in 1975. After fascist dictator Antonio Salazar died in 1970, his successor, Marcelo Caetano, tried to initiate a softer form of the Estado Novo, or new state, that ruled over Portugal and its subjects. This resulted in the Carnation Revolution in 1974, a democratic Portugal, and, crucially, a glorious opportunity for resistance fighters in its overseas holdings. Mozambique in Southeast Africa was the first to claim independence, embracing the values of socialism as an antidote to the fascism they had experienced under colonial rule. Over in the west of the continent, the Angolans were doing the same thing. Angola had been fighting a war of independence since the early 1960s, but the fall of the Estado Novo opened the doors to a long-awaited triumph. What should have been a glorious victory for the Angolans quickly turned sour as the groups who had united to kick the Portuguese out of their country swiftly began to fight among one another. And so, the MPLA and FNLA found themselves on opposite sides of a brutal civil war that would last for decades. International intervention in regional conflicts was certainly not unheard of. The Americans and the Chinese quickly involved themselves in the Korean War, while American and Australian troops fought side by side in the jungles of Vietnam. The Soviet Union and the United States went head-to-head in a proxy war in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the 1960s, a precursor to the disastrous Afghan occupation by the USSR some 20 years later. But in Angola, the Cold War took on a new turn. In the Angolan Civil War, it was not American boots on the ground nor Soviets, but Cuban, as Fidel Castro sent his troops across the Atlantic to bolster the cause of socialism in Africa. This was not a move sanctioned by the Soviet government in Moscow. This was a communist country acting of its own accord to support a leftist cause in a conflict thousands of miles beyond its borders. The first intervention of this kind for Cuba, it would certainly not be the last. back in East Africa, the Derg was also finding life difficult post-revolution. Rival factions within the provisional organization grappled for power, resulting in another civil war that would last for almost 2 decades and would deliver such horrors as the Kshitiz or Red Terror, a series of massacres and atrocities perpetrated by government allies desperate to retain power. The tumult and violence that gripped Ethiopia represented an opportunity for Somalia. At Somalia's western border, a wedge of Ethiopian territory effectively splits the north and south of the country. This wedge of land is known as the Ogaden, and Somalia planned to annex it into their own territory, effectively closing off Ethiopia's access to the Red Sea and capturing its largest airbase. But this was more than just a logistical aim, or a military or even ideological one. It was something much deeper rooted. Many of the peoples of the Ogaden shared an ethnic and cultural identity with those on the Somalian side of the border. With so much bloodshed now unfolding within Ethiopia, annexation would protect these ethnic Somalis while also expanding the nation's own borders. Plans were drawn up and an invasion force was prepared. The idea of 2 socialist states going to war appalled Castro. In 1977, the Cuban premier flew to Aden in South Yemen, ready to put forward the idea of a socialist union between the states of Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea. The union between Egypt and Syria, the United Arab Republic, had failed 6 years previously, but Castro believed it could be different this time. The 3 countries shared borders, creating one contiguous landmass, and the union would supposedly bring peace and stability to a region in turmoil. The Somalian government, still under the command of Siad Barre, who had seized power in 1969, was having none of it. On July 12th, the Somalis invaded, pushing through Ogaden lands and occupying 60% of the territory by the end of the month. Aided by allied groups within Ethiopian territory, notably the WSLF, or Western Somali Liberation Front, the invaders ripped through the Ethiopian defenders and made short work of their divisions and military hardware. But international opinion was not on the side of Somalia. While the USSR had supported the Somalis with equipment, they sided with the Ethiopians, sending General Vasily Petrov to Addis Ababa as an advisor. The Soviet general was reportedly dismayed by the state of the Ethiopian equipment, and the USSR sent a vast airlift of arms and supplies to shore up the Ethiopian defenders. Communist regimes such as South Yemen and North Korea pledged direct assistance to the Ethiopians, although only the Yemenis would be able to put soldiers into action. East Germany, another communist state, offered other supports such as training for troops. Even non-communist Israel, who did not maintain official diplomatic relations with Ethiopia, armed the Derg against the invading Somalis. Despite international opposition, the war was going well for Somalia in its initial phases, effectively dominating Ethiopian airspace with its MiG-21 planes and pushing right up to the outskirts of Dire Dawa, a city of enormous strategic significance to both sides. But such gains wouldn't last. After trying to bring about a ceasefire, the USSR decided to ditch Somalia altogether, throwing its full weight behind the Ethiopian cause, but stopping short of sending regular troops. In the communist world, only China and Romania supported Barre and his Somali army, although neither would provide meaningful assistance to Somalian forces on the ground. After a disastrous opening to the war, the weight of support for the Ethiopians was beginning to tell, and the defenders gradually re-established airborne supremacy. What's more, the strategic objective of Dire Dawa was proving a tough nut to crack, and the Somalian forces were taking enormous casualties in each engagement as the defenders clung on. The war was in its 2nd month, and it appeared the tide was turning. The most significant foreign intervention, however, was yet to occur. By September, Ethiopia controlled only 10% of the Ogaden, but was far from defeated. With air superiority now theirs, Ethiopian planes were able to hit Somali armor hard, while the rainy season slowed Somalian advances. There was also significant infighting between the Somali National Army and their WSLF allies, making further progress difficult. But it was the Battle of Harar from October 1977 to January the following year that would bring the biggest turning point of the war. The ranks of the Ethiopians had been swelled by a huge recruitment drive, and a militia of 100,000 men had joined the cause. Alongside them were 1,500 Soviet military advisors and 16,000 soldiers from Castro's Cuba, ready to put an end to the conflict. Exhausted, battered, and broken, the Somalis fell back in January 1978. Things were looking bleak for Siad Barre, and they were about to get bleaker still. In February 1978, the Ethiopians launched their counterattack. Ethiopian and Cuban soldiers fought side by side, pushing the Somalis back across the Ogaden region and reversing the gains of the previous year. Then, the coalition made a move that even the embattled Somalians didn't expect. They broke northeast, sending a column of Ethiopian and Cuban troops into the unforgiving terrain that separated Jijjiga from the Somalian border. Supported by Soviet helicopters and by a withering Cuban artillery bombardment, the Ethiopians took Jijjiga in only 48 hours, leaving as many as 6,000 Somalis dead or wounded. The game was up. By mid-March, all Somali units had withdrawn and all seized territory was ceded back to Ethiopia. The war was over. Cuban and Ethiopian soldiers had marched together to victory in the Horn of Africa. The war was an unmitigated disaster for Siad Barre and his regime. Over 6,500 Somali troops lay dead in the Ogaden, with 2,500 wounded. The armed forces had lost 28 aircraft, 11 helicopters, and more than 200 tanks, losses they could ill afford. 500,000 ethnic Somalis living in the Ogaden were displaced. What's more, the communist states of the USSR, Cuba, North Korea, and East Germany had abandoned Somalia when it mattered. Ongoing friendships with China and Romania would not be enough to quell the increased isolation of Somalia on the world stage. While an attempted coup d'etat in April 1978 threatened to bring an end to the Barre regime. But Barre, his ears still ringing from the carnage of the Ogaden, was not going to relinquish power without a fight. His Red Beret Special Forces units committed horrific atrocities against rebel clans, and a bitter civil war broke out in Somalia, with the legacy of that civil war costing countless lives and leaving many more in abject misery. Advice from the US State Department regarding travel to Somalia recently went viral. Among other tidbits, the memorandum recommended drafting a will, leaving DNA samples in case your family needs to access them, and discussing plans and funeral wishes with loved ones. This shattered country and the heartbreaking loss of life seen here in the Horn of Africa is the legacy of those few short months in 1977 and 1978. Even today, Somalia's suffering has not yet ended. The Great Toyota War was the nickname for the final phase of the Chadian-Libyan conflict. This was due to the many Toyota Land Cruisers and Hiluxes used by the Chadian forces in place of armoured vehicles. But what started the conflict, and why did Toyotas see so much combat? In this video, we'll be diving into this crazy story. Following the Second World War, European nations started decolonising Africa. Not because they'd finally seen the error of their ways, but because they were so riddled with debt they could no longer afford to maintain their colonies. Throughout the 1950s until 1975, many independence treaties were negotiated, and the African continent went through major political change. As with most great power shifts throughout history, the decolonisation of Africa was rife with violence. Rebellions, coups, and civil wars plagued the continent, and a number of dictators forced their way into power. One such dictator was the now infamous, and now dead, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Gaddafi seized power in 1969 following a coup d'etat. Like many dictators, Gaddafi was an ultra-nationalist who wanted his country to be as self-sufficient as possible. He wanted to take back everything, land, resource or otherwise, that he felt had been stolen from Libya. A long chunk of land in northern Chad, called the Al Zaw Strip, was among the things Gaddafi wanted to reclaim. In 1935, France controlled Chad and Italy controlled Libya. The two European nations entered an agreement in which France would give the Al-Zawr Strip to Italy as part of a post-World War I award. Though the leaders in France and Italy signed the treaty, it was never ratified and the Al-Zawr Strip remained part of Chad. Gaddafi felt that the Al-Zawr Strip was Libya's rightful property. Therefore, in 1972, he began an intervention in Chad. At this time, the country was in the midst of a bitter civil war, and Libya was supplying Chadian rebels with weapons to secure allegiances with them. Giving so much military power to the rebels made Chad's authoritarian leader, Francois Tombalbaye, nervous, which opened the door for Gaddafi to enter negotiations with Tombalbaye. These negotiations ended with Gaddafi occupying the Al-Zawr Strip, but promising that he'd stop sending supplies to the Chadian rebels. The Al-Zawr Strip wasn't anything special, mostly desert and sparsely populated. However, it was rumored to have uranium deposits, which Gaddafi wanted very badly. And more than anything, the occupation of the Al-Zawr Strip was a way for Gaddafi to puff his chest and show off Libya's increasing wealth and power within North Africa. Libya owned the Strip fair and square for 3 years after the occupation. That changed when Francois Tombalbaye was overthrown in 1975. The Chadian military didn't like Gaddafi's influence in their country, which reopened hostilities between the two nations. So once again, Gaddafi began supplying weapons to the northern rebels. There were a series of military interventions by Libya in the late 70s and early 80s, with France lending Chad a hand during some of them. In 1983, a line was drawn across the country with the pro-government forces in southern Chad and rebel groups in the north. Because Gaddafi had aligned himself with the Chadian rebels and had been supplying them with AK-47s, RPGs, mortars, and recoilless cannons, he indirectly controlled half of Chad. Military bases he'd constructed in the Al-Zawr Strip further consolidated his influence. The conflict raged on throughout most of the 1980s. In support of 5,000 Chadian rebels, Gaddafi brought 7,000 troops, 60 combat aircraft, 300 tanks, and a number of Mi-24 helicopters and artillery pieces to bear. This compares to just 5,000 poorly armed troops in the south. Even with French support, the forces of southern Chad were no match. Libya's equipment was far from state-of-the-art, but they far outclassed the Chadians. What the Libyans lacked, however, was organization. Gaddafi's troops hadn't been trained to act as assault infantry, to do reconnaissance, or to do anything except give the Chadian rebels weapons and an extra hand here and there. After some success early in the conflict, like taking the capital city in 1981 alongside the rebels, the Libyans got somewhat complacent and began losing motivation. So in 1986, when the Chadian rebels turned on Gaddafi following a number of defeats, the Libyans were screwed. On the other hand, the southern troops welcomed defected rebels with open arms, doubling their numbers. While the northern rebels had far more advanced military knowledge, having been trained by East German officers, the southern forces had a secret weapon. The French had provided the southern Chadian forces with 400 brand new Toyota pickup trucks, mostly Hiluxes and some Land Cruisers. But why these cars? Toyota created Hilux in 1968 to compete with American-made pickup trucks. The aim was to create a comfortable and extremely durable vehicle that would outperform its competitors. Today, the Hilux is so well known for being durable, it has earned the nickname the Nokia of trucks. To prove that point, the BBC's popular show Top Gear put the Hilux's robustness to the test. The host submerged one of these vehicles in the sea, dropped a caravan on it, smashed it with a wrecking ball, set it on fire, and then put it on top of a skyscraper, which they then demolished with explosives. And the Hilux still started. Hiluxes were also great because soldiers didn't need special training to drive them, and any halfway decent mechanic could repair one no matter how banged up it got. They were a major asset to the Chadian forces, and the vehicle's unassuming nature played a major role in Chad's ultimate victory. As we said before, Gaddafi and the Libyans were up a creek without a paddle after their rebel allies ditched them. The dictator's forces were scattered. They had no knowledge of the area and no clear plan for success. Morale was low, and most soldiers were confused as to why they were there at all. Still, Gaddafi pursued conflict under the impression that superior equipment would be enough to secure victory. The Chadians, however, were much more of a threat than Gaddafi gave them credit for. They used their enemy's disorganization to buy time and lay out a winning plan. The soldiers were highly motivated, knew the land, and knew their enemy. And they had Toyotas. They fitted the trucks with artillery, machine guns, and anti-aircraft guns gifted to them by France and the US. With the French providing air cover, they launched their counter-offensive on January 2nd, 1987, catching the Libyans completely off guard. The Chadians first attacked the Libyan-held city of Fada, almost annihilating the Libyan armored brigade. The Libyans were shocked that their tanks were no match for the Toyotas, which ran circles around the slow-moving armored vehicles and fired at them with ease. The Chadians took out 100 tanks in that first battle alone, while the Libyans destroyed just 3 Toyotas. In March of that same year, the Chadians quickly captured the Owadi Doum airbase, which had been defended by 5,000 Libyan soldiers, as well as armored vehicles, tanks, aircraft, and fields of landmines. With Libyan aircraft grounded because of the French, and with Toyotas ruining Libyan tanks with their anti-tank guns, all the Chadians had to worry about were the landmines. Luckily for them, they found paths through the minefields, which meant they could drive right up to the airstrip virtually unopposed. There's even an unverified account that if the Chadians drove over the mines at speeds of 100 km per hour, they didn't trigger the mines at all. Within the first few months of the Chadian counterattack, an estimated 3,000 Libyan soldiers had either been captured or killed, or they'd deserted. Chadian forces had all but recaptured the country, with one notable exception: the Al-Zal Strip. So why stop now? The French, however, would not press on, concerned an attack on the Strip would lead to an international conflict. The Chadians, would have to continue without air support. While they captured the town of Al-Zal with relative ease, they soon learned that it was much harder to defend with Toyotas than it was to attack with them, especially now that the Libyans could attack them from the air. The Chadians were driven out of the Al-Zal Strip just 20 days after they captured it. But that defeat did not break their spirits. They regrouped and came up with a new plan. They would drive 200 kilometers into Libya and attack Ma'aten al-Sada airbase. Not only were they successful in this attack, but they also made it to the airbase completely undetected. It was a slaughter. In one night, the Libyans lost between 1,000 and 1,700 soldiers, 70 tanks, at least 30 APCs, and between 26 and 32 aircraft. By comparison, the Chadians lost 65 men and a handful of Toyotas. The attack on the airbase scared the French as they weren't sure if the Chadians would continue their offensive in Libya. If they did, and the conflict escalated further, the French could have been implicated by the Libyans in the invasion of their country. Even though the French removed themselves from the conflict before the Chadians got to the Al-Zal Strip, they played a major role in helping the Chadians get there in the first place. So, a few days after the attack in September 1987, the French called for a ceasefire, hoping to save themselves from being pulled into a war they didn't want to fight in. Luckily for them, the two fighting nations agreed to the ceasefire. Many feared that fighting between Chad and Libya would start again, but the ceasefire violations that did occur were minor. By October the following year, Chad and Libya resumed diplomatic relations. In September 1990, the two countries agreed to hand the matter of the Al-Zal Strip over to the International Court of Justice. 4 years later, the court ruled in favor of Chad. The Al-Zal Strip was returned to the Chadians and the matter was laid to rest. As for the Toyotas, the Chadians had started a global trend. The trucks are now ubiquitous in conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. The Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser are the preferred vehicles of rebel groups all over the world, and Australians. But what do you think? Do you think Toyotas could win again? Do you think Toyota should stop making these trucks? Do you know of any vehicles that are as tough as the Hilux? Let us know in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.